Recorded history begins with the first written word, but the earth is littered with monuments that don't need language to speak. Sky-aligned stones, engineered landscapes, and precision cuts that shouldn't exist yet. If these are the fingerprints of civilizations older than writing, who built them? What did they know, and why did they vanish without a name? The first lie we learn about the past is simple. Without writing, there is no history. Yet across deserts, highlands, and drowned coastlines, the earth keeps contradicting that rule, quietly, relentlessly, in stone. We call it prehistory as if it were darkness, but it is only a different archive. Layers of ash sealed beneath floors, pollen locked in lake mud, charcoal that still carries time in its fading carbon. These are pages too, and when they are read with care, they whisper a dangerous possibility. Complex societies rose, coordinated and built, then vanished without leaving a single line of text. This documentary follows those whispers to their sources, where monuments stand like corrupted hard drives. Their builders left no names, no chronicles, no royal boasts, only geometry, quarry scars, and alignments that meet the sky on the same mornings year after year. The question is not whether these places are real, it is what they demand we redefine. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what is? Is it the moment humans learn to synchronize labor across seasons, to store memory in ritual and architecture, to measure the year with shadows and stars? Or is civilization something even older, something that can survive the loss of language and still announce itself through planning, logistics, and precision? We will move through landscapes that were never meant to preserve anything, tropics that rot archives into soil, river valleys that rearrange their banks, and seas that climb inland until entire worlds are erased. And still, evidence remains. Worked stone where no city should be, ceremonial spaces where no throne is found, and technologies that imply training, specialization, and long chains of instruction. But every trace comes with a warning, because the past does not speak cleanly. Radiocarbon dates must be calibrated, contexts can be disturbed, alignments can deceive, and looting can turn priceless histories into orphaned objects. Our task is to hold wonder in one hand and method in the other, so the story grows sharper, not louder. As the images rise over ridgelines and sink beneath cold water, one truth will keep returning. Civilization did not wait for ink. It emerged wherever people learned to coordinate, remember, and reshape their world, and it disappeared wherever seas rose, climates pivoted, and the fragile materials of daily life dissolved into silence. Tonight we begin a countdown not of empires, but of absences. 10 civilizations that existed before recorded history, and 10 clues to why so many chapters were lost. What survives is not a complete message. It is a set of witnesses, stone and starlight, asking us to read what writing never captured. From a hilltop sanctuary older than cities to drowned plains beneath the North Sea, we will follow 10 sites that rewrite the timeline, and in the end we will widen the lens to the planet itself, asking what Earth does to memory and what it may still be hiding. Recorded history begins with writing, and that starting line shapes everything we think we know. It tells us when kingdoms rise, when laws harden, and when names become permanent in ink and clay. But it also hides a deeper past, because silence in ink is not silence in life. Most textbooks treat prehistory as a waiting room, where humans drift until someone invents a script. That framing is convenient, because writing produces dates, rulers, and tidy sequences that feel safely chronological. It is also biased because it privileges societies that wrote on durable media and preserved archives through conquest, fire, and time. It can erase complex cultures that built in stone, traded at distance, and measured the sky with patient attention. Even the word prehistory carries a quiet insult, as if everything before text was merely preparation. Yet for more than 95% of our species' time, humans lived without writing, and still made decisions that reshaped landscapes. They domesticated plants, managed herds, and engineered tools with astonishing refinement. They organized rituals, formed alliances, and carried memory across generations without a single written line. Writing appears late compared to what humans were already doing. In Egypt, the earliest hieroglyphs cluster around 3100 BCE, near the first dynasties and the consolidation of royal power. In Sumer, Proto-cuneiform appears around 3500 BCE, tied to accounting, administration, and the need to track grain, labour and debt. Those dates matter, but they are not the first evidence of organised society, nor the first proof of sophisticated thought. Early writing is not born as poetry, and it is rarely born as philosophy. It begins as marks that make institutions legible: tokens, tallies, seal impressions, and lists that stabilise authority over distance. A sign pressed into clay can standardise a transaction, and a tablet can outlast the person who spoke the deal. That durability is powerful, but it also distorts our sense of beginnings. A threshold based on writing implies that civilization begins when words begin. Yet civilization is not a single invention, and it is not only a political label reserved for states. It is a set of capacities, including planning, specialization, coordination, and shared symbolic systems that bind strangers into cooperation. If those capacities appear earlier than texts, then the timeline must move, and our definitions must loosen. Prehistory is not the absence of history. It is history without written narration, where the record is physical, partial, and often accidental. The past still speaks, but it speaks through layers, isotopes, and patterns that require translation. The question becomes how to read a world that did not leave sentences, only traces. Archaeology starts with context, because objects without context become myths. A stone blade in a private collection is a story without a setting, and the setting is where meaning lives. Stratigraphy reads the order of layers, showing what came first and what arrived later as people returned, rebuilt, or abandoned. A wall cut by a pit is older than the pit, even if both are stone and both look ancient. Sometimes the most dramatic evidence is not an artifact but a boundary. A floor sealed by ash preserves a moment, an eruption, a fire, a sudden departure, like a snapshot pressed into the earth. Footprints can harden in mud, then vanish under sediment, and reappear thousands of years later under a trowel. No one wrote those steps down, yet the ground kept the record. Radiocarbon dating anchors organic remains to calendar time, within known margins of error. It measures the decay of carbon-14 in wood, bone, and seeds, comparing what remains to what should be present in living tissue. It does not date stone directly, but it dates what people burned, ate, and built with when the stone was set. When multiple samples converge, a site gains a timeline that does not need kings to validate it. Radiocarbon also forces humility, because it is statistical rather than absolute. Calibration curves correct for changes in atmospheric carbon through time, and those curves are built from independent archives like tree rings. Dates arrive as ranges, not single points, and interpretation depends on careful sampling and contamination control. The method is powerful precisely because it admits uncertainty, while still narrowing the possible past. Dendrochronology sharpens time further where preserved wood exists. Tree rings record annual growth, and overlapping sequences build long regional calendars that can stretch back millennia. A beam can be dated to the year it was cut, and sometimes to the season if the final ring is intact. In the right conditions, trees become clocks that outlast empires and outargue legends. Paleoclimate proxies widen the frame beyond any single site. Ice cores trap ancient air, preserving greenhouse gases, dust, and volcanic signals in frozen columns that can be counted and sampled. Lake sediments record floods, droughts, and erosion in layered pages that build year by year. Pollen counts trace shifting vegetation, showing when landscapes opened into grassland or when forest returned like a closing door. These proxies matter because societies do not develop in a vacuum. Climate can reward stability, then punish it with sudden change that arrives within a human lifetime. A warming trend can expand resources, then a cold snap can collapse them, turning reliable water into uncertainty. If we want to understand early complexity, we must track the environment that shaped choices and constrained imagination. Archaeastronomy tests whether structures encode the sky and their geometry. Alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills can be measured, modelled, and compared against local horizons. Precision suggests repeated observation and shared calendars, not a lucky guess made once. When monuments point to celestial events, they hint at organised knowledge without written tables, knowledge learned by watching and remembered by building. The sky is not only beautiful, it is useful. The rising point of the sun shifts across the year, and the moon's long cycle can mark years within years. For communities dependent on seasonal harvests, migrations, or ritual gatherings, timing becomes survival. A corridor that catches first light on a specific morning is a public instrument, and it teaches without words. Residue analysis recovers invisible traces from tools and containers. Lipids absorbed in pottery can reveal milk, fish oils, or plant resins, even when the vessel looks empty. Microscopic starch grains can identify tubers and cereals, and phytoliths can point to grasses that left no seeds behind. Pigments and binders can show how people made paints, medicines, and adhesives, turning chemistry into a translator for vanished practices. Ancient DNA adds another dimension, because bones carry population history inside their cells. Genomes can track migrations, mixing, and isolation across millennia, revealing contact where artifacts alone seem ambiguous. Pathogen DNA can expose disease burdens that shaped demography and movement, sometimes long before symptoms were described. Kinship analysis can show family structures inside cemeteries, even when names are lost and stories are gone. Remote sensing expands the search beyond what is visible at ground level. LIDAR can strip away forest canopy, revealing terraces, roads, and buried grids that the eye cannot follow through leaves. Satellite imagery can detect soil marks, moisture differences, and ancient river channels that guide excavation like a map. Ground-penetrating radar can sketch subsurface walls without excavation, letting the landscape become legible at scale. This toolkit does more than find artifacts. It reconstructs systems, including food production, labor organization, and long-distance exchange that leaves faint but consistent signatures. It can estimate how many people worked, how they moved materials, and how they coordinated time across seasons. It can reveal planning that looks familiar, even when the dates feel impossible. It also changes what counts as evidence, because absence is no longer an excuse. A missing text does not mean missing organization, and a missing palace does not mean missing authority. Sometimes power is distributed, sometimes it is ritual, and sometimes it is embedded in shared practice rather than written law. The ground can preserve those arrangements in the shape of a plaza, the width of a road, or the rhythm of rebuilding. Here the tension begins because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. Across continents, there are sites that demand surveying, logistics, and sustained cooperation over long spans of time. Some show megalithic construction that required quarrying, shaping, and transport with disciplined repetition. Others show engineered water control, standardized layouts, or precise orientation that implies measurement, not improvisation. Many appear millennia before the first dynastic inscriptions, and that gap is the provocation. If these projects existed before writing, then someone still organized them, and someone enforced standards. Someone allocated labor, resolved disputes, and maintained shared purpose across seasons of hunger and abundance. Someone held knowledge that could be taught and repeated, not guessed once and forgotten. The absence of text does not remove the need for institutions. It only removes the names, the titles, and the flattering origin myths that later states loved to carve. We are left with the work itself, stone on stone, earth cut and moved, alignments held steady across generations. Effort becomes the document, and precision becomes the signature. We should be careful with the word civilization, because it carries modern expectations. It can imply cities, states, and formal bureaucracy, which may not fit early societies that organize differently. But complexity can take other forms, including ritual centers, seasonal aggregation, and distributed networks that share standards without a single capital. A society can be advanced in engineering and astronomy without looking like a later empire. This documentary follows that possibility, without pretending every mystery is solved. We are not hunting for fantasy continents or perfect utopias that conveniently explain every gap. We are tracing how early humans could build, measure, and exchange at surprising scales, using tools that leave little trace. We are asking why some achievements appear, then vanish, leaving only fragments and questions. The central question is simple, and it refuses to stay quiet. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what marks the real beginning, and who gets to decide? What do the oldest monuments, landscapes, and scientific traces reveal about advanced societies before recorded history? And why did so many of them disappear, or transform beyond recognition? To answer, we need a recurring rule for this series. Stone remembers what paper forgets. Monuments are corrupted hard drives from a lost era, storing data in angles, weights, and wear patterns that accumulate slowly. They can be damaged, repurposed, and misread, but they rarely lie about effort and intention. A block moved uphill is an argument that cannot be erased. It implies planning, leverage, and a workforce that showed up again and again until the job was done. It implies food, water, and coordination, because exhausted workers do not move stone on empty stomachs. It implies leadership, even if that leadership was temporary, negotiated, or sacred. Stone also preserves contradictions that later stories smooth over. A temple platform can predate the myths attached to it by thousands of years, and the myth will still claim authorship. A road can outlast the language of its builders, carrying new feet with new gods. A quarry scar can show industrial intensity where we expected small bands, and it can force a recalculation. The material record pushes back against our assumptions, and that pressure is productive. It reminds us that simple is often a label we apply because we lack documentation. It also reminds us that ingenuity does not require bureaucracy, only shared goals and reliable methods. When we confront what people were capable of, we also confront what we may have overlooked. Still, the record is incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of the drama. Coastlines have shifted, drowning settlements that once sat on fertile shores and turning harbours into deep water. Rivers have changed course, burying fields under silt or cutting them away in a single flood season. Forests have reclaimed plazas, and deserts have swallowed canals, hiding geometry under sand. The past is not only forgotten, it is physically hidden. Whole chapters may lie underwater on continental shelves, where sea levels rose after the Ice Age and erased coastal worlds. Other chapters may lie beneath modern cities, where excavation is slow and politically difficult. The archive exists, but it is scattered, and it does not volunteer its secrets. That is why the threshold of writing is so misleading. Writing survives unevenly, and it begins in specific administrative contexts that favour elites and their needs. Many early societies may have used perishable media like wood, fibre or skin, which rot and vanish in most soils. Others may have encoded memory in performance, architecture and ritual, where the text is the act itself. When we equate history with text, we mistake preservation for importance. We also confuse the survival of archives with the survival of people, which are not the same. A society can be influential and still leave little writing, especially if its knowledge is guarded, oral, or embedded in craft. The absence of tablets can be a clue about values, not a verdict on capability. A better approach is to treat writing as one technology among many. It is powerful for accounting, law, and propaganda, and it can stabilize institutions across distance and time. But it is not required for surveying a horizon or aligning a corridor to a sunrise. It is not required for organizing a quarry or managing seasonal labor through shared obligation. It is not required for building a cosmology that makes strangers feel related. So we begin before the first word, and we widen our definition of evidence. We listen to dates extracted from charcoal and bone, and we accept ranges that still narrow the past. We watch layers stack and cut, showing sequences without chronicles and without royal lists. We compare alignments to the sky, and we test residues for food, pigments, and medicine. We read genomes and landscapes, and we let patterns replace names. We follow trade signatures in stone sources, shell distributions, and metal traces, because materials travel even when stories do not. We watch how settlement patterns cluster and disperse, because movement is a kind of sentence written across terrain. We ask what must be true for a monument to exist, even if we never learn who gave the order. This is not an argument against recorded history. Texts are invaluable, and they can preserve voices that would otherwise vanish into dust. But texts also reflect power, because elites write, and archives serve states, temples, and markets. The deeper past is often the story of people without scribes, whose achievements were credited to others or forgotten. If we want a fuller human story, we must accept other archives. We must treat soil as a library, bones as biographies, and climate records as the background music that shaped every decision. We must also accept that certainty is rare, and that good science often speaks in probabilities. The reward is a past that is larger, stranger, and more human. The stakes are larger than curiosity because origin stories shape identity. If complex societies existed earlier than we admit, then human potential is older and more widespread than our timelines suggest. It implies that innovation is not a straight line from simple to advanced, but a branching path with dead ends. It suggests cycles of growth and loss, driven by climate, conflict and migration. It also reframes disappearance, which is as important as emergence. A society can collapse without leaving a final inscription, and the silence can be mistaken for emptiness. Knowledge can disperse into smaller communities, then reappear later in altered form, like a melody remembered imperfectly. Techniques can survive in craft traditions while political structures dissolve, hiding sophistication in plain sight. The end of a civilization may look like silence, but it may be transformation. People can abandon monuments yet keep calendars, abandon cities yet keep roots, abandon rulers yet keep stories. When we look only for capitals and scripts, we miss the quieter forms of continuity. The ground, however, often preserves the transition in broken layers and rebuilt floors. Across this series, we'll count down 10 ancient civilizations that existed before recorded history. Each chapter will focus on a place where the evidence pushes beyond the standard timeline, forcing a reassessment. We will examine what was built, what was known, and what networks sustained it across distance. We will also examine what changed, and what forces could erase so much so quickly. We will not claim certainty where the data is thin. We will separate measurement from speculation, and we will show where debates remain open among specialists. But we will also take the evidence seriously, even when it challenges comfortable narratives taught as settled. The deep past deserves the same rigor we give to dynasties, and the same respect. The opening move is to return to a world on the edge of transformation. Near the end of the last ice age, temperatures swung hard and fast, and the climate system behaved like a shifting machine. Sea levels rose, then surged again, redrawing coasts and drowning lowlands that once held camps and routes. Rain belts shifted, reshaping grasslands and deserts, and turning familiar hunting grounds into uncertainty. Human groups faced new opportunities and new pressures, often at the same time. Melting ice opened corridors and revealed new resources, while rising water erased old ones. Seasonal rhythms changed, and with them the timing of plants, animals, and travel. In that instability, planning became more valuable, and shared gathering places could become anchors. In that climate whiplash, the foundations of later history were laid. People gathered, experimented, and built places that pulled communities together, sometimes for trade and sometimes for ritual. Some of those places were not cities, but they were not simple camps either, and their scale makes that clear. They were nodes of labour, belief, and knowledge, built for a future no one could predict. Now the countdown begins, not in palaces with inscriptions, but in the deep hinge of the Ice Age world. We start where stone first insists on memory, and where the sky may have served as a calendar for human coordination. We start before the first word, because the first word was never the first idea. We start where the evidence is older than the stories, and where the ground still refuses to be quiet. Now the countdown begins, not in palaces with inscriptions, but in a hill of worked limestone. In southeastern Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe forces the central question into stone. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what does this sanctuary reveal? It stands before cities, before kings, and before farming becomes the dominant way of life. From a distance, the mound looks almost ordinary, an uneven rise against a wide, wind-brushed plateau. Up close, the ground feels engineered, as if the hill itself has been composed. The limestone underfoot is pale and granular, catching harsh sunlight in a way that makes edges glow. When the camera drops low, you see tool marks and cut faces that do not belong to nature. This is not a ruin that collapsed into the earth. It is a place that was built, used, and then hidden. Göbekli Tepe sits near the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. In the early Holocene, this region held rich, wild cereals and dense game. The climate was stabilizing after the last ice age, and rainfall patterns supported grasslands and open woodland. Hunter-gatherers could move through a landscape that rewarded seasonal knowledge, because ripening stands and migrating herds arrived on schedule. The site is not a village in the usual sense, and it is not a tomb. It is a monumental complex built for gathering, ritual, and shared meaning. To understand why this matters, it helps to remember what before farming really means here. These communities were not primitive in their perception of the land. They tracked plant cycles, animal behaviour, and water sources with an accuracy that kept families alive. They likely knew where wild corn and barley grew thickest, and when gazelle and wild cattle moved through nearby corridors. Their world was mobile, but it was not random. Its order lived in memory, roots, and repeated seasons. Scientific grounding starts with the dates and with how dates are made. Radiocarbon does not date stone, so archaeologists date charcoal, bone, and other organics in context. Carbon-14 forms in the atmosphere and enters food webs, and living organisms carry it until they die. After death, the isotope decays at a known rate, leaving a measurable ratio that becomes a clock. Those measurements produce radiocarbon years that must be calibrated to calendar years. Calibration matters because atmospheric carbon-14 has varied through time. A raw radiocarbon number becomes a calendar range only after correction against independent records. Those records include long tree ring sequences, lake sediments, and corals that preserve annual or near-annual signals. The calibration curve is not a straight line, and some periods contain wiggles, where the same radiocarbon value can match more than one calendar interval. That is why archaeologists speak in probability ranges rather than single dates. It is also why a timeline can be robust in outline while remaining flexible in its fine detail. The main construction and occupation span is usually placed around 9600 to 8200 BCE. That range comes from multiple samples across layers and features, not a single dramatic reading. It also shifts as new samples are taken from better contexts. A bone from a later fill can mislead if it is assumed to date a wall. A charcoal fleck can be older than the burning event if it came from old wood. Context is everything, and context is fragile. A seed charred in a hearth that sits on a floor is a strong anchor, because it likely died when the floor was in use. A piece of charcoal washed into a pit can be a traveller from an earlier fire. Archaeologists therefore track where each sample came from, how it relates to architecture, and whether it might have moved. They also compare dates from different laboratories, because small procedural differences can matter. Calibration curves also improve, and that can move dates by decades or more. Better curves come from longer tree ring sequences and refined datasets. Better sampling comes from targeting short-lived materials like seeds, rather than long-lived timber. Each new measurement tightens probability ranges, but it also tests earlier assumptions. The result is a timeline that is strong, yet always provisional in its fine detail. This is the quiet discipline behind the spectacle. A monument can make us feel certainty, because stone looks permanent. The science insists on humility, because the past is reconstructed from fragments and likelihoods. Even so, the broad conclusion holds, these enclosures belong to a time when agriculture was emerging, not yet dominant. That placement alone is enough to disrupt older narratives. Archaeologists describe phases based on stratigraphy and architecture. The earliest monumental phase is associated with large circular or oval enclosures. Later activity includes smaller structures and different building habits. The sequence is not a simple rise and fall, and it is not a single building event. It is repeated construction, use, modification, and then deliberate burial. Stratigraphy is the site's internal memory, layers stacked like pages, each one recording activity and change. Floors are resurfaced, walls are repaired, and pits are cut into older deposits. When an enclosure is filled, that fill becomes a sealed archive, preserving whatever was placed inside. The challenge is that later actions can intrude into earlier layers, and the archaeologist must read those cuts like scars. Every trowel stroke is an argument about what happened first. The architecture is the first shock, because it looks like a later world. Each enclosure is defined by stone walls and massive T-shaped limestone pillars. Many pillars stand around 5 to 6 meters tall, and some weigh many tons. Two taller central pillars often dominate an enclosure, facing inward like paired presences. The T-shape suggests stylized human forms, with arms and hands carved in relief on some examples. In the light of early morning, the pillars cast long shadows that rotate slowly across the floors. The camera can circle a central pair and reveal how their faces are blank yet somehow attentive. On some pillars, the carved arms wrap forward, and the hands meet near the belly, as if holding an invisible belt. The stone is not merely structural, it is figurative, and the figure is larger than life. Even without a face, the body language is unmistakably intentional. These are not rough stones set upright by chance. Pillars were quarried, shaped, and smoothed with consistent proportions. Their placement follows planned geometry within each enclosure. The walls include built benches and carefully fitted stones. The floor surfaces show preparation and maintenance, not a one-time improvisation. Planning at this scale implies measurement, even if it was done with chords and practice sightlines rather than written plans. Circular forms require a centre point and a sense of radius, and the repeated success suggests a shared method. The builders also had to anticipate load and stability, because a leaning pillar can crack or topple. The benches along the walls hint at gathering, watching, and perhaps instruction. They turn the enclosure into a room, not an open-air scatter of stones. Iconography covers the pillars and sometimes the walls. Reliefs show foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and other animals. Some figures appear in dynamic poses, with teeth, tails, and movement emphasized. There are also abstract signs, including H-shapes, crescents, and other motifs. The carvings are deliberate, repeated, and placed where participants would see them. The camera can linger on a fox rendered with a taut body and a lifted tail, its outline crisp against the pillar's pale surface. Snakes coil in stacked bands, their bodies crossing as if the stone itself is alive with motion. Boars appear heavy and bristling, with a physicality that suggests respect and risk. Birds stretch long necks and wings, sometimes clustered, sometimes solitary, as if marking different kinds of presence. These images are not casual decoration. They are positioned like statements. Interpretation must stay disciplined because symbols invite overreach. We cannot read a written myth because there is no text. We can compare motifs across enclosures and across nearby sites. We can ask what animals were common in the environment and in the diet. We can test whether certain species cluster in certain spaces, suggesting social groups or ritual roles. This is where archaeology becomes both cautious and imaginative. If foxes appear repeatedly on particular pillars, that pattern may reflect identity, affiliation, or a story performed in the enclosure. If snakes concentrate near entrances, they might signal thresholds, warnings, or protective power. If birds appear in association with headless human forms at other sites, they might connect to mortuary ideas, even if Göbekli Tepe is not a cemetery. Each proposal must be tied to distribution, context, and comparison, not to modern intuition. Fox imagery may point to a valued animal, a clan emblem, or a narrative now lost. Snakes may signal danger, transformation, or seasonal cycles, but certainty is not available. Birds may connect to the sky, scavenging, or the movement of souls, but that remains hypothesis. The safest claim is that the builders shared a symbolic system. That system was stable enough to be carved in stone and understood by participants. Stability matters because carving is slow, and slow work is a commitment. A symbol that changes every season is not worth cutting into a multi-ton pillar. The repeated motifs suggest an agreed vocabulary, and vocabulary implies teaching. It also implies that newcomers could be initiated, learning what to do, where to stand, and what the images meant. In that sense, the art is not only expression, it is infrastructure for shared belief. The carvings also imply skilled specialists. Relief work demands time, technique, and tool control. Flint tools must be sharp, and the carver must understand how limestone fractures. A community must support carvers while they produce non-subsistence labour. That support can be seasonal, but it must be organised. Skill suggests teaching and apprenticeship, which implies continuity across years. Specialisation does not require a full-time class of artisans, but it does require recognition of expertise. Someone had to decide which stone was suitable, which face would carry an image, and how deep a relief could be cut without weakening the pillar. Mistakes would be costly, because a cracked monolith is not easily replaced. The presence of consistent style hints at conventions, and conventions hint at authority. Even in a world without formal titles, some voices carried weight. Labour and logistics drive the next question, because the stones are heavy. Limestone was quarried from bedrock near the site, and quarry scars show extraction. Pillars were detached, shaped, and moved without wheels or draft animals. Transport likely used sledges, rollers, ropes, and coordinated pulling. Erection required leverage, ramps, and careful control to avoid catastrophic failure. The quarry is its own kind of evidence, negative space that outlines what was removed. You can see channels cut around a pillar to be, and you can imagine the moment it finally separated from the bedrock. The sound would have been sharp, a crack that meant success or disaster. Then comes the slow movement across uneven ground, the friction of stone against wood, and the constant risk of a slip. Every metre travelled would have been a small victory. Multi-ton pillars do not move with a handful of people. They require dozens, possibly more, working in rhythm and under direction. That direction could be a leader, a council, or ritual authority, but it is still authority. Planning includes tool production, food provisioning, and scheduling. It includes knowing when groups can gather without risking survival. Coordination at this scale is a social technology, as real as any tool. People must trust that others will pull when signaled and rest when commanded. They must accept a plan that outlasts a day's hunt. They must believe the goal is worth the strain, the blisters, and the calories burned. When the pillar finally rises, the achievement is not only engineering, it is collective discipline made visible. Seasonal aggregation is a strong model for how this could work. Small bands could disperse for hunting and foraging, then converge at predictable times. The gathering itself could be the institution, renewing alliances and settling disputes. Ritual could provide the reason to show up and the pressure to contribute. Feasting could convert surplus into obligation and status, creating a ritual economy. Feasting leaves traces, and those traces can be measured. Animal bones can show which species were consumed and whether they were taken in particular seasons. Cut marks and breakage patterns reveal butchery and marrow extraction, indicating both abundance and intensity. Large quantities of remains suggest events beyond daily meals, moments when many people ate together. In such settings, generosity becomes power, and power becomes a reason to build. A ritual economy does not require money, but it requires accounting in memory. Someone tracks who contributed labour, who brought meat, and who owes reciprocity. Someone decides which enclosure gets repaired and which pillar gets carved next. Coordination becomes a social technology, even without writing. The monument becomes a public ledger made of stone and effort. The ledger is also emotional. When you pull a rope beside another group, you create a shared story of hardship and success. That story can be retold at the next gathering, reinforcing belonging. It can also be used to demand future contributions, because participation becomes proof of commitment. Göbekli Tepe, in this sense, is not only a place, it is a mechanism for making society larger than kin. Here the tension begins, because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. Göbekli Tepe suggests complex coordination before agriculture dominates daily life. The older story says farming creates surplus, surplus creates specialists, and specialists build monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses the direction of that arrow, or at least complicates it. For decades, many models treated hunter-gatherers as limited by mobility, as if movement prevented complexity. Yet complexity can travel, because it lives in relationships, obligations, and shared ritual. A monument does not require permanent houses around it, but it does require repeated return. That repeated return can create a centre of gravity, drawing people back to the same hill, the same images, the same rules. The question becomes unsettling. Did belief build the first large structures, and did those structures then reshape the economy? The reversal hypothesis argues that monument building helped create the conditions for farming. Large gatherings increase demand for predictable food supplies. Demand encourages intensified harvesting, storage, and landscape management. Over time, those practices can push wild plants toward domestication. In this view, ritual and social cohesion are not byproducts of agriculture. They are engines that help make agriculture attractive and possible. This is not a romantic claim that religion magically invents farming. It is a practical chain of pressures and solutions. If hundreds of people arrive for a gathering, the hosts cannot rely on luck. They need reliable calories, and reliability favours planning. Planning favours storage, and storage favours staying close to productive stands. Over generations, those choices can alter landscapes and eventually genomes. This hypothesis does not claim the builders were already farmers in the later sense. It claims they were experimenting in a transitional world. They could exploit wild cereals intensively, and they could manage stands near camps. They could store food for gatherings, and storage changes decision-making. Once storage exists, planning horizons lengthen, and risk becomes calculable. Risk calculation is a subtle revolution. When food can be kept, people can invest labour in projects that do not feed them immediately. They can schedule work parties, promise future feasts, and survive a bad week without moving camp. Storage also creates something worth protecting, which can increase territoriality and negotiation. In that way, the same practices that support a monument can also support more permanent settlement. Archaeologists test these ideas with plant remains, toolware, and site networks. Grinding stones can indicate cereal processing at scale. Microwear on sickle blades can suggest harvesting grasses repeatedly. Charred seeds can show whether grains were wild or domesticated forms. The evidence is debated, but the broader pattern is clear. Monumental ambition appears early, and it appears in a landscape moving toward cultivation. Plant remains are small, but they are decisive. Under a microscope, the shape of a grain and the structure of its attachment scar can indicate domestication, because domesticated cereals tend to hold onto the stalk differently. Phytoliths, tiny silica bodies formed in plants, can survive when other tissues decay, offering clues about grasses and reeds. Residues on grinding stones can reveal what was processed and how often. Each method is partial, but together they build a picture that is increasingly difficult to dismiss. Göbekli Tepe also raises questions about social order. The enclosures imply controlled space, with entrances and focal points. The central pillars create a stage for shared attention and shared rules. Participation likely required knowledge of rituals and acceptable behaviour. That knowledge functions like law even if it is spoken and performed. Controlled space is a form of power. When an enclosure directs movement, it also directs experience, guiding eyes toward the centre and bodies towards certain positions. The benches along the walls suggest audiences, and audiences imply performance. Who stood near the central pillars and who watched from the perimeter? Who spoke, who sang, who kept silence? Even without written codes, repeated ritual can train people into shared norms. The site scale suggests it served more than one small group. It may have been a regional centre where different communities met. Shared iconography could bridge dialects and kin lines. Shared labour could reduce conflict by binding groups into mutual projects. In a world without states, monument building can still produce governance through obligation. Governance here would not look like a palace or a bureaucracy. It would look like expectations enforced by reputation, reciprocity, and the fear of exclusion. If you break the rules, you may lose access to alliances, mates, or shared feasts. If you contribute, you gain standing and protection. The monument becomes a neutral ground where disputes can be managed under sacred authority. It is politics, but performed through stone and ceremony. Then comes the deliberate burial, one of the site's defining mysteries. Many enclosures were intentionally backfilled with debris and sediment. This is not slow abandonment with windblown soil. The fill includes broken stone, animal bone, and occupational material. The pattern suggests purposeful closure rather than accidental loss. The image is striking, a sanctuary not destroyed by enemies, but sealed by its own builders. Layer by layer, the space is packed until pillars disappear, as if the community is lowering a curtain. The act would have taken time and labour, which means it was not a casual decision. It also means the closure was witnessed, remembered, and likely explained in ritual terms. Why bury something so costly to create? Several theories compete, and each can be tested in different ways. Ritual closure suggests a planned end to a sacred space. A community might seal an enclosure after a cycle of use, then build another. Social change suggests the institution that sustained the site lost support or legitimacy. Environmental stress suggests shifting resources made large gatherings harder to maintain. Ritual closure has parallels in many later traditions, where sacred objects are retired rather than discarded. Sealing can mark the completion of obligations, or the transfer of power to a new space. Social change could involve new forms of authority, new alliances, or new settlement patterns that made regional gatherings less necessary. Environmental stress could tighten food margins, turning communal labour into a risk rather than a triumph. None of these explanations is exclusive, and the truth may combine them. Archaeologists look for signatures in the fill and in the surrounding landscape. Rapid backfilling should show consistent sediment sources and limited weathering between layers. If closure was ritual, deposits may be structured, with repeated materials and deliberate breakage. If closure followed conflict, there may be burning, trauma evidence, or abrupt discontinuities. If climate played a role, regional proxies should show drying, cooling, or resource shifts during the relevant centuries. These tests are slow, and they are often indirect. Sediment micromorphology can reveal whether soil was dumped quickly or accumulated gradually, because microscopic layering preserves the rhythm of deposition. Bone assemblages can show whether animals were processed in feasts or in ordinary meals. Botanical shifts in nearby cores can suggest changing vegetation, which would affect game and wild cereals. The site is not just excavated, it is interrogated through multiple lines of evidence. The burial also protects, which complicates interpretation. Sealing can preserve carvings and floors from later damage. That suggests the builders cared about what remained, even as they covered it. It can be an ending that is also a form of respect. It can be a decision to hide power rather than destroy it. There is a haunting possibility here. If the enclosures were considered dangerous or too potent, burial could be containment. If they were considered sacred, burial could be preservation for ancestors or spirits. The act of covering may have been accompanied by speeches, offerings, and final meals on the edge of the pit. We cannot hear those words, but we can see the intention in the volume of fill. As the enclosures disappear under fill, the story does not end. The region continues to change, and settlement patterns shift toward more permanent life. Across the broader Fertile Crescent, villages grow and farming intensifies. Domestic architecture becomes more common, and storage becomes central. The skills used to coordinate ritual labour can be redirected toward fields, herds, and walls. This redirection is one of history's great pivots. The same ability to schedule work parties can organise planting and harvest. The same authority that assigns labour to a pillar can assign labour to a canal or a granary. The same shared symbols that unify a gathering can unify a neighbourhood. Civilization in this view is not a sudden invention. It is a gradual reapplication of capacities that already existed. This is the hinge that leads to the next chapter's transition. A ritual centre shows coordination without cities. The next step is when domestic life and monumental ambition fuse at larger scale. The question becomes how a gathering place becomes a settlement, and how memory becomes built environment. Göbekli Tepe does not give us names, but it gives us capacities. It shows organised labour, durable symbolism, and planned construction in the 10th millennium BCE. It shows that hunter-gatherers could build institutions strong enough to move stone. It shows that civilization can begin as coordination, long before it becomes writing, and it forces an uncomfortable observation. If people could organise this much without agriculture, then civilization is not a reward for farming alone. It is a property of human cooperation, amplified by shared purpose. What other forms of complexity have we failed to recognise, simply because they left fewer durable traces? What kinds of leadership existed that never carved their names? The central question sharpens as we leave the hill. If such coordination existed this early, how many other chapters are missing? How many coastal sites were drowned by post-Ice Age seas, taking their evidence with them? How many perishable institutions vanished, leaving only stone anchors like this one? Göbekli Tepe stands as a witness that the deep past was not waiting. It was already building. From here, the countdown moves from sanctuary to settlement. We follow the same human capacities into denser living, longer permanence, and larger shared projects. The next site will show what happens when the monumental and the domestic stop being separate worlds. It will show the first known city-scale settlement, where daily life becomes the engine of collective ambition. From here, the countdown moves from sanctuary to settlement. In central Anatolia, Çatalhöyük asks a sharper question about civilization without writing. The camera rises over a flat plain, and then the mound appears, low, broad, and deceptively quiet. It does not look like a city at first glance, yet it holds centuries of daily decisions. The timeline is long, and the persistence is the point. Occupation begins around 7400 BCE and continues until roughly 6000 BCE, which is long enough for traditions to harden and then subtly change. Generation after generation returns to the same place, not because it is easy, but because it works. The settlement grows upward as much as outward, and time becomes architecture. This mound is a tell, formed when mud brick walls slump in rain, floors get capped with fresh plaster, and new rooms are built atop old rooms. The process is slow, almost patient, and it produces a hill made of collapsed houses. In cross-section, the tell looks like a layered cake of clay, ash, and lime. Each rebuild is a decision to stay, and each layer is a compromise between memory and practicality. Archaeologists read the tell like a stacked archive. Each layer holds hearth ash, plaster repairs, footprints in packed clay, and the debris of ordinary meals. The excavation grid becomes a kind of map of time, where every trowel stroke risks erasing a clue. A single room can contain dozens of micro-events, preserved because the next floor sealed the last one. Microstratigraphy pushes deeper, separating thin lenses of soot, trampled dust, and replastered surfaces that mark days, not centuries, Under magnification, a floor is not one thing, but many things. Fine ash from a cooking fire, gritty sand tracked in on feet, and bright lime plaster laid down with care. Specialists can sample these layers for micro-charcoal, plant silica, and tiny fragments of bone. The aim is simple in plain language, to see routine, not just ruins. A floor is not just a surface, it is a timeline. Repeated replastering can show seasons of use, changes in household routines, and moments of crisis or renewal. Lime plaster itself is a technological choice, because it requires heating limestone to make quicklime. That heating demands fuel, and fuel demands labour and landscape access. Even the whiteness of a clean floor carries a cost. When a wall is cut by a burial pit, the cut proves sequence, even without a written date. The pit slices through earlier plaster, and the edges show where the fill was packed back in. Archaeologists call these relationships stratigraphy, but the logic is intuitive. What cuts must be later than what is cut, and the house becomes a diagram of cause and consequence. The scale is urban in density, even if the word city feels modern. At its height, the settlement may have held several thousand people within a compact footprint. Estimates vary because they depend on how many houses were occupied at once, and how many people lived in each. Yet the crowding is visible in the architecture, and it is hard to ignore. Çatalhöyük is built as a continuous mass of mud brick houses. Walls touch walls, and exterior streets are largely absent at ground level. From above, the settlement reads like a tight mosaic of rectangles, with little empty space between them. The visual is striking: an urban block before the street, a neighbourhood before the avenue. Movement happens across rooftops with ladders dropping into interior spaces like vertical doorways. A person climbs, steps onto a roof, and walks along a flat surface that doubles as a corridor. Openings in the roof act as entrances, and smoke stains mark where hearths breathed upward. In reconstruction, the roofs feel like a second ground, suspended above the buried past. This design changes how we imagine neighbourhood life. Rooftops become shared circulation, work areas, and social thresholds between households. The sun bakes clay, and the wind carries cooking smells across the roofscape. People pass one another at close range, and privacy becomes something negotiated rather than guaranteed. A person can cross the settlement without stepping into an open street, because the roofs function as the streets. That means the skyline is busy, not empty. Ladders, baskets, and bundles move overhead, and voices carry from roof to roof. The city's public space is elevated, and its social life is literally on top. Inside, houses repeat a recognizable plan. Platforms line the walls, raised areas used for sleeping, working, and ritual display. The platforms are smooth and pale, sometimes edged with red pigment, and they reflect light into otherwise dim rooms. The arrangement creates a familiar choreography of movement, where the body learns the house by repetition. Ovens and hearths anchor daily cooking, while storage bins and niches manage grain, tools, and household goods. Fire is central, and not only for food. It hardens clay, dries plaster, and turns raw materials into usable things. The hearth becomes a technological hub, and the soot above it is a record of meals and seasons. The repetition suggests shared norms rather than elite commands. If there were master builders or planners, their authority is not expressed through palaces or grand avenues. Instead, the built environment looks standardized through tradition, apprenticeship, and community expectation. Knowledge travels through hands, and the city reproduces itself by teaching. Standardization does not mean sameness in every detail. Small differences in platform size, storage placement, and wall treatment imply household choices. Yet the overall grammar of the house stays consistent, as if the community agrees on what a proper home should be. It is a powerful kind of conformity, and it does not need a king to enforce it. Defense is implied, but it is not expressed as walls and gates. A wall-to-wall settlement reduces exposed edges, and roof access can be controlled by removing ladders. The absence of streets also reduces direct pathways for intruders at ground level. The architecture creates a kind of passive security without a visible fortification line. This is a different defensive logic than later cities advertise. Instead of monumental walls that declare power, Çatalhöyük uses compactness and controlled entry. The city is hard to penetrate quickly, and harder to navigate without local knowledge. Security emerges from design, and design emerges from shared habits. Here the tension begins, because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. Dense urban living appears without obvious kings, without a central temple, and without administrative texts. We are trained to expect bureaucracy when people gather in large numbers. At Çatalhöyük, the crowd comes first, and the paperwork never arrives. If later civilizations announce hierarchy with palaces and monuments, Çatalhöyük hides power in plain sight. There is no clear throne room, no royal tomb, and no single building that dominates the rest. The most prominent structures are still houses, and the most intense spaces are still domestic. The question becomes whether authority can be distributed, situational, and still effective. Distributed authority is difficult to picture because it leaves fewer obvious traces. It may live in elders, in ritual specialists, or in skilled craftspeople whose expertise earns influence. It may appear as consensus, backed by social pressure rather than force, and it may shift from context to context. Who leads a hunt may not lead a burial. Ritual is not separated from domestic space, and that is the next shock. The most intense symbolism is inside houses, embedded in walls, platforms, and repeated acts. Religion here is not a distant institution, it is a household practice. The sacred does not sit on a hill apart, it sits beside the oven. Wall paintings appear in some rooms, layered across replastered surfaces. Motifs include geometric patterns, animals, and scenes that remain debated in meaning. Reds and blacks stand out against pale plaster, and the images sometimes reappear after being covered. The key point is repetition, because repeated imagery implies shared stories and shared rules. The paintings are also physical evidence of skill and planning. Pigments must be sourced, prepared, and applied before the plaster fully sets. Some colours likely come from iron-rich ochres, ground into fine powders and mixed with binders. The act of painting is time-consuming, which means it is valued enough to justify the effort. The crania, the mounted horns and skull elements of cattle, are set into walls and platforms. They turn architecture into a display of dangerous strength and controlled power. The horns curve outward, casting shadows that shift with firelight. In a small room, that presence can feel overwhelming, even now. The presence of wild cattle symbolism matters, because early herding is still developing in this period. Wild aurochs were large, fast, and genuinely dangerous animals. To hunt them required coordination, courage, and perhaps ritual preparation. Bringing their horns into the house is not decoration alone, it is a claim about identity and capability. Some rooms are rebuilt with careful continuity, as if memory is architectural. A platform may be replastered again and again, preserving its position through generations. The edges become rounded with time, and the surface becomes a palimpsest of touch. The house is not just occupied, it is curated. When a house is abandoned, another may rise in the same footprint, keeping the household map stable. This continuity suggests that place matters as much as structure. People return to specific locations within the mound, as if the ground itself carries rights and obligations. The city becomes a grid of remembered spaces. The dead are part of the house, not removed to a distant cemetery. Burials are placed under floors and platforms, often in positions that suggest careful wrapping and placement. The body is folded, lowered, and then sealed beneath a surface that will be lived on. Ancestors remain literally beneath daily life, turning the home into a lineage archive. This practice changes the emotional geometry of the house. A platform is where you sleep, but it is also where someone rests beneath you. The boundary between living space and mortuary space dissolves, and remembrance becomes routine. The house contains both warmth and absence, held together by plaster. Bioarchaeology turns these burials into evidence about identity. Skeletal analysis can estimate age, sex, and health stress, while isotopes can track diet and mobility. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes can indicate reliance on plant foods versus animal protein, and oxygen isotopes can hint at where a person grew up. Ancient DNA and kinship studies can test whether those buried together were biological relatives. The results complicate simple assumptions. Some burials under the same house are not close kin, which suggests households are social units, not just families. Identity may be built through adoption, alliance, and shared labour as much as through blood. In other words, belonging can be made, not merely inherited. This has consequences for how we imagine governance. If households are flexible, then authority may be flexible too. A house could be a cooperative group, a work team, and a ritual community at once. The The city's stability might come from these small units negotiating constantly, rather than obeying a single centre. Skulls are sometimes removed and curated, then reburied or displayed. This practice echoes wider Neolithic traditions across the region, where the head becomes a focus of memory. The skull is portable, durable and recognisable, which makes it a powerful object for commemoration. It suggests that personhood can persist through objects and ritual handling. Ritual intensity varies by house, which hints at status differences without formal titles. Some houses show more paintings, more bucrania, and more elaborate features. The pattern suggests prestige, but prestige expressed through household history, rather than centralised rule. A house becomes important by accumulating meaning, not by being granted authority. Economy anchors the settlement in practical survival. People practice early agriculture, cultivating cereals and pulses suited to Anatolian conditions. Wheat and barley provide reliable calories, while legumes add protein and resilience to diets. Farming also requires planning across seasons, and planning requires shared expectations about labour. Herding grows in importance over time, with sheep and goats becoming key sources of meat, milk, and fibre. Managing herds means managing movement, breeding, and grazing pressure. It also means living close to animals, which changes the sensory world of the settlement. The smell of dung and the sound of bleating become part of daily life. This is not a simple farming village, because exchange links it outward. Obsidian tools are common, and obsidian sources lie at distance in volcanic regions. The glassy stone fractures into razor edges, and it becomes the preferred material for blades and cutting tools. Geochemical sourcing can match artifacts to specific flows, mapping networks without written contracts. Obsidian is more than a sharp edge, it is a social tracer. When a blade's chemistry points to a far mountain, it implies travel, trade partnerships, and repeated routes. Those routes are not abstract lines, but paths walked with loads, weather, and risk. They connect households to strangers, and strangers to shared standards of value. Exchange also implies communication. People must agree on what counts as a fair return, even if the return is delayed. They must remember who gave what, and who still owes something. In a world without writing, memory becomes an economic instrument, and reputation becomes a kind of currency. Other materials extend the map. Shells, pigments, and rare stones appear despite the inland setting, suggesting long-distance movement of goods and ideas. A shell bead is small, but it carries the sea with it, and it carries the story of how it arrived. Exchange does not require markets with coins, but it does require trust, reciprocity, and remembered obligations. Craft production appears inside the domestic sphere. Toolmaking, beadwork, textile-related activities, and food processing occur within houses and on roofs. Stone flakes scatter near working areas, and grinding stones wear down from repeated use. The roof becomes a workshop under open sky, where light is better and smoke can drift away. Specialization exists, but it is embedded in households rather than segregated into workshops. One house may be known for fine blades, another for beads, another for careful plastering. Skills can circulate through marriage, apprenticeship, and neighbourly exchange. The city's economy is thus distributed, yet coordinated. This embedded economy supports a different model of complexity. Instead of a state extracting surplus, households coordinate through shared norms and mutual dependence. The settlement functions as a network of units that are similar, yet not identical. Complexity emerges from repetition plus variation, like a pattern woven from many hands. Health and environment reveal the costs of this arrangement. Crowding increases exposure to pathogens, and skeletal markers can reflect infectious disease load. Close living means microbes move easily, especially when people share roofs, entrances, and interior air. The bones do not preserve fevers, but they can preserve the long shadow of illness. Close living with animals can intensify zoonotic risk, even before later urban epidemics. Herding brings animal waste, parasites, and insects into closer contact with humans. The shift is subtle at first, but it is profound over time. A successful food strategy can also be a biological gamble. Indoor air is another hidden pressure. Hearths and ovens produce smoke, and soot accumulates on walls and ceilings. In a small room with limited ventilation, smoke lingers at breathing height. Bioarchaeological evidence can show respiratory stress, and the architecture suggests that ventilation was limited. The visual evidence is immediate. Darkened plaster near roof openings suggests years of burning, and the smell of smoke is easy to imagine. Firelight flickers on painted walls, and the room becomes both intimate and hazardous. Comfort and risk share the same space. Diet shifts as farming intensifies. Reliance on cereals can increase calories, but reduce dietary diversity, affecting dental health and nutrition. Teeth record this transition through cavities, wear patterns, and enamel defects linked to childhood stress. A mouth becomes a ledger of meals, and a skeleton becomes a record of scarcity. Work also leaves marks on bodies. Repetitive labour can reshape joints, and heavy carrying can stress spines and knees. In a dense settlement, daily tasks include hauling water, fuel, and building materials across roofs and ladders. The city's vertical circulation has a physical price, paid in cartilage and bone. The environment around the site changes under human pressure. Farming and herding can drive deforestation, erosion, and altered water regimes. Clearing trees for fuel and building exposes soil, and grazing can reduce plant cover that holds the ground together. As local resources thin, people must travel farther for timber, reeds, and grazing, increasing time costs. These pressures create feedback loops. More people require more fuel, and more fuel requires more landscape change. More landscape change can reduce harvest stability, which increases stress on households. The city's success becomes the source of its vulnerability, because density magnifies every shortage. Complexity carries benefits, but it also carries fragility. A dense population depends on stable harvests and predictable access to resources. When climate shifts or local landscapes degrade, the margin for error narrows quickly. The question is not whether problems occur, but how long the system can absorb them. The end of Çatalhöyük is not a single dramatic collapse. The settlement gradually changes, with shifts in building patterns and eventual dispersal into smaller communities. The mound does not burn in one catastrophic night, and it does not empty all at once. Instead, the rhythm slows, the rebuilding changes, and the centre of gravity moves. The reasons likely include environmental pressures, social reorganisation, and changing regional networks. If exchange routes shift, the city's advantages can fade. If nearby land becomes more attractive, households may choose space over density. If social bonds strain under crowding, dispersal can be a solution rather than a failure. This ending fits the series theme, because disappearance is often transformation. People can leave a tell and carry practices elsewhere, leaving the mound as a sealed memory. Skills, stories, and rituals can migrate even when walls do not. The absence of writing means the story is told through layers, not chronicles. Çatalhöyük forces a definition problem that will follow us. If civilization means coordination, shared symbols, and dense living, then it qualifies without kings. If civilization requires palaces, armies, and written administration, then it becomes invisible by definition. The site confronts our categories, and it refuses to fit neatly inside them. The central question tightens here. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what do these houses reveal about governance, memory, and identity before texts? The evidence suggests that institutions can live in architecture, ritual, and routine. It also suggests that power can be real even when it's quiet. So we leave Anatolia with a final unease about what's missing. Inland tells preserve mud brick histories because they rise above flood and tide. Their slow accumulation protects fragile traces, like paint, plaster, and footprints. Coastal worlds do not get that protection, and sea level rise can erase them completely. Next, the countdown turns toward the coasts, where shorelines have migrated for millennia. Rising seas may hide entire settlements beneath continental shelves, leaving only gaps where cities should be. The deep past may be richest where we cannot easily dig. What other Çatalhöyüks lie underwater, dense, unwritten, and waiting in the dark? Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but coastlines can delete chapters before any word survives. Doggerland is not a legend of sunken temples, it is a real plain erased by rising seas. When we picture prehistory, we often imagine caves and forests, yet the most crowded places were frequently the edges of water. Those edges are also the first places the ocean reclaims, quietly, persistently, and with almost perfect efficiency. Between Britain and continental Europe, the North Sea once held dry land, rivers, lakes, and wide wetlands. In that vanished space, the horizon would have looked familiar to any modern walker. low ridges, reed beds, open grass and distant tree lines. Herd animals would have left braided tracks through damp soil, while birds lifted in sudden clouds from the marsh. On calm days, shallow lakes could reflect the sky like sheets of dark glass, broken only by ripples from fish. After the last ice age, glaciers retreated and sea level rose, exposing a temporary land bridge. For thousands of years, that bridge was a homeland, a corridor, and a hunting ground. It linked not only places, but families, seasonal routes, and shared knowledge. The idea is simple to state, yet hard to absorb. An entire region that once shaped human lives now lies under meters of seawater. Doggerland formed as ice sheets locked up ocean water, lowering seas and revealing the continental shelf. During the coldest phases, so much water sat on land as ice that global sea level dropped by tens of meters. That drop widened coastlines everywhere, turning today's seabeds into plains and peninsulas. In the North Sea basin, the effect was dramatic, because the shelf is broad and gently sloped. A small vertical change in sea level could translate into many kilometers of horizontal shoreline movement. As the climate warmed, meltwater returned to the ocean and the shoreline marched inland. The map changed on a human timescale, not in a single day but across lifetimes. A grandparent could describe a ford that a grandchild would never cross. A remembered hunting spot could become a tidal flat within a few generations. When the land itself is moving, memory becomes a kind of navigation tool, and also a source of grief. To understand the loss, we need paleogeography in plain terms, not a wall of numbers. Paleogeography is simply the study of old landscapes, reconstructed from clues in sediments and landforms. It asks where the rivers ran, where the hills stood, and where the shoreline rested. Around 12,000 BCE, the world was still emerging from glacial cold and seas were far lower. By roughly 6,000 BCE, much of the shelf had flooded, leaving Britain an island and Doggerland underwater. That timeline matters because it overlaps with real human lives, not abstract epochs. It also overlaps with a period of rapid climate shifts, when temperature, rainfall and vegetation changed quickly. In northern Europe, forests expanded as conditions warmed, replacing open tundra-like habitats with birch, pine and later mixed woodland. As trees spread, so did new animals, new plant foods and new ways to hunt. Doggerland was not a static stage. It was a changing environment that demanded constant learning. Sea level did not rise smoothly like water in a bathtub, and that matters for human memory. Scientists describe meltwater pulses, periods when ice sheets collapsed faster and oceans climbed more quickly. These pulses can be driven by destabilized ice margins, warming oceans, undercutting ice shelves, and sudden drainage of glacial lakes. In those centuries, coastlines could retreat noticeably within a few generations, turning familiar routes into tidal hazards. Even a modest acceleration could redraw a river mouth, salt a wetland, and change where fish spawn. Doggerland reframes the idea of lost civilizations by shifting the cause from war to geology. A society can vanish without burning, conquest, or abandonment simply because the ground becomes sea. That is a difficult kind of disappearance, because it leaves no dramatic ruin for later people to find. When the archive is submerged, absence of ruins becomes a predictable outcome, not a mystery. The ocean does not preserve cities the way deserts do. It grinds, buries, and disperses. The evidence begins with accidents, because the sea keeps returning what it took. Fishing nets snag antlers shaped by tools, bones marked by cuts, and stone points dulled by use. Dredging for sand and gravel pulls upworked flint, hammerstones, and fragments of daily life. Sometimes a single object, an antler pick, a barbed point, a polished fragment, carries the unmistakable signature of hands. It is a strange kind of message, delivered without context, hauled up from darkness into daylight. These finds are not arranged like a museum display, and context is often damaged by the way they are recovered. A trawler does not record stratigraphy, and a dredge mixes layers that once sat far apart. Salt water can abrade surfaces, and modern industrial activity can scatter deposits. Even so, repeated discoveries in the same zones signal that people lived and worked across this drowned landscape. Patterns emerge through accumulation, the way a coastline emerges from fog as you approach. Archaeologists and geologists then rebuild context using methods designed for invisible terrain. Seismic mapping sends sound waves into the seabed, and reads the returning echoes as layered structure. The equipment may ride behind a survey vessel, releasing pulses that travel down through sand and mud. Those reflections outline buried river channels, ancient shorelines, and the contours of hills now hidden under sediment. On screen, the data becomes a ghost map. Valleys and ridges drawn in grayscale, as if the sea were briefly transparent. Seismic images can even show where rivers once braided and migrated across the plain. A channel cut into older sediments, then filled with younger material, becomes a readable signature. In places, the outlines suggest estuaries widening as sea level rose and lakes shrinking or turning brackish. These are not artistic reconstructions. They are measurements translated into shapes. The result is a landscape that can be navigated again, at least in the mind. Sediment cores add time to the map because each core is a vertical sample of buried history. A coring rig pushes a tube down into the seabed and extracts a column of mud, sand, and peat. In a lab, scientists read grain size, chemistry, and microfossils to infer changing water conditions. A shift from peat to marine mud can mark the moment a wetland became an estuary. Dark, organic, rich layers can signal stagnant ponds or marshes, while clean sands can indicate stronger currents. Dating those layers turns texture into chronology. Radiocarbon dating can be applied to plant fragments, shells, or bits of charcoal trapped in sediments. The dates are not perfect, and calibration is required, yet they allow researchers to bracket when environments changed. A core can show centuries of stability, followed by a rapid transition that matches known sea level events. In that way, the seabed becomes a timeline, not just a surface. Pollen analysis turns those cores into a record of vanished forests and grasslands. Pollen grains are tough, and different plants produce distinctive shapes that survive for millennia. Under a microscope, a trained eye can distinguish tree species, grasses, and salt marsh plants. When tree pollen declines and salt-tolerant plants rise, the ecosystem is telling us the sea is winning. When freshwater species vanish, it suggests salt intrusion, tidal influence, and altered river flow. Other proxies fill in the living world that artifacts alone cannot describe. Plant macrofossils, insect remains, and microscopic algae reveal whether water was fresh, brackish, or fully marine. Beetles can indicate temperature and habitat, because many species are picky about moisture and vegetation. Diatoms, tiny algae with silica shells, shift as salinity changes, acting like a chemical sensor preserved in mud. Together, these traces reconstruct a plain that was not empty, but productive and diverse. They also reveal how quickly that productivity could be disrupted. This is the key shift in perspective for the central question of the series. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what do scientific traces reveal about societies without texts? Doggerland answers with an ecosystem map that functions like an unwritten archive. Instead of chronicles, we have pollen curves and channel patterns, yet they still speak of choices and constraints. They show where people could travel, where they could camp, and what they could eat. On that plain, human life fits the Mesolithic, a period often mislabeled as simple because it lacks stone cities. Communities moved seasonally, following fish runs, migrating game, and ripening plants. Mobility was not aimlessness. It was a strategy tuned to a landscape of abundance. It also reduced risk because moving prevents overharvesting and keeps groups close to shifting resources. In a wetland world, knowing when to move could matter more than building walls. Complexity here looks different because it is built from knowledge, roots, and cooperation rather than masonry. People needed detailed calendars of weather, tides, and animal behavior to survive and thrive. They also needed social networks to share territory, exchange mates, and manage conflict. A network can be as real as a road, even if it leaves no stone trace. How many agreements, stories, and remembered boundaries vanished with the land that held them? Rivers were the main arteries, and Doggerland had many, braided across lowlands toward the sea. Riverbanks concentrate resources, offering fresh water, reeds, fish, birds, and grazing animals. They also concentrate people, making repeated camps and meeting places likely. A river is a travel corridor and a food source at once, and it also offers predictable landmarks in flat terrain. In a world without maps, rivers are maps. Archaeology on land teaches us what to expect from such communities, even when the sea hides the sights. We expect hearths, tool-making scatters, butchered bone, and worked wood that rarely survives on dry ground. In waterlogged settings, wood can endure, hinting at traps, platforms and boats. Wetlands can preserve footprints, woven fibres, and delicate plant remains that would otherwise decay. That possibility is one reason Doggerland is so tantalising. It may still hold organic technologies we rarely see. The North Sea has yielded hints of that perishable world, including worked timbers and organic remains. These are rare, but they matter because they show technology beyond stone. A wooden spear, a paddle, or a fish weir can represent planning, engineering, and shared labour. A fish weir, for example, is not a casual tool. It implies knowledge of currents, seasonal fish behaviour, and coordinated construction. It also implies a schedule, because such structures must be maintained. Doggerland also challenges the word civilization, which we often reserve for writing cities and kings. Mesolithic groups could coordinate large tasks, maintain long-distance contacts, and manage territories through custom and memory. Their institutions were real, but their materials were fragile. If leadership existed, it might have been situational, tied to hunting skill, ritual authority, or knowledge of routes. What would a political system look like if its main infrastructure was trust and shared practice? Here the tension begins, because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. If complex life can flourish without monuments, then the archaeological record is biased toward what survives. Coastlines, wetlands, and wooden technologies can vanish, leaving a false impression of emptiness. The sea does not just hide sites, it selectively erases the kinds of sites that were most common. That bias can shape modern stories, making inland stone seem like the default path of human development. As seas rose, Doggerland did not disappear overnight, and the slow loss shaped human decisions. First, low valleys flooded, and rivers widened into estuaries that still offered fish and birds. Brackish water can be rich, and estuaries are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Then, higher ground became islands, and travel required more boats and more risk. A short walk becomes a crossing, and a crossing becomes a gamble when weather turns. This gradual inundation would have forced repeated adaptation rather than a single migration. Camps moved upslope, routes shifted, and familiar hunting grounds became mudflats. People likely returned to shrinking places out of habit and attachment, even as the sea advanced. Attachment is not a modern invention, it is a human constant, tied to graves, stories, and the feel of a familiar shoreline. When a place disappears, it is not only land that is lost, but orientation. Sea level rise also changes the social map, because it compresses populations into less land. As the plain narrowed, groups that once ranged widely would meet more often at bottlenecks. That can increase exchange and intermarriage, but it can also increase competition. A narrowing corridor can become a contested zone, especially when resources concentrate along remaining river mouths. In such conditions, alliances matter more, and conflict becomes harder to avoid. Then comes the possibility of catastrophe layered on top of slow change, and Doggerland has a candidate. Around 6200 BCE, the Storegga Slide, a massive underwater landslide off Norway, generated a tsunami. The slide likely involved enormous volumes of sediment collapsing down the continental slope. That collapse displaced water suddenly, sending waves outward with the speed of an express train. In the open sea, a tsunami can be low and fast, but near shore it rises into a wall. The tsunami is not a mythic flood story, it is a geologic event with measurable signatures. In coastal sediments, scientists find sand layers deposited far inland, sometimes containing marine microfossils. Those layers can be dated and correlated across regions, linking distant shores to one shock. The sand can sit abruptly atop peat or soil, like a scar across the stratigraphy. It is the kind of evidence geology excels at preserving, an instant recorded in grains. For communities already living with encroaching water, a tsunami is a multiplier of loss. It can destroy camps, drown people, and contaminate freshwater with salt. It can also erase the very traces we would later search for, scattering tools and bones into the sea. In low-lying wetlands, even a modest surge can push seawater far inland, killing plants and changing soils. Afterward, the land may still exist, but it behaves differently, and it feeds you differently. After such an event, the psychological landscape changes along with the physical one. A coastline that seemed predictable becomes dangerous, and a lowland that fed you becomes a threat. Even if people returned, they would return with new caution and new stories. Oral traditions can encode hazard knowledge, turning disaster into guidance about where not to camp. We cannot hear those stories directly, yet the need for them is written into the risk. Doggerland's end is best understood as a sequence of retreats, punctuated by moments of sudden violence. Meltwater pulses raised baseline sea level, then storms and tsunamis delivered acute blows. Over time, the remaining high ground became smaller, more isolated, and less worth defending. A shrinking island can still be home, but it demands constant vigilance and constant transport. At some point, the cost of staying outweighs the meaning of staying. Displacement does not always look like collapse, and that is another lesson for the series. People can move and survive, carrying skills into new regions while their old homeland vanishes. The loss is still real, because places hold memory, identity, and rights. A move can preserve a community, yet it can also fracture it, splitting groups along different routes. When land disappears, it forces choices that no one can make without consequences. Britain's separation from Europe is often told as a geographic fact, but it is also a social rupture. A land bridge that once allowed easy travel became a water barrier requiring boats and planning. That shift changes trade, marriage networks, and the spread of ideas. It also changes who meets whom, and how often, which slowly reshapes culture. Isolation is rarely absolute, but even small frictions can redirect history. The drowned plane also complicates how we interpret later cultural differences across the channel. When a corridor becomes a boundary, communities diverge more easily. Languages, tool styles, and traditions can drift apart, not because people change suddenly, but because contact became harder. Over centuries, reduced interaction can amplify local innovations and local identities. The sea becomes not just a feature on a map, but a filter on human connection. Doggerland therefore answers the central question with a warning about our sources. If civilization began wherever humans learned to coordinate, remember and reshape their world, then many early chapters were coastal. Those chapters are exactly the ones sea level rise is most likely to erase. The result is a skewed archive, where survival of evidence masquerades as importance. We must ask, again and again, what kinds of societies our methods are least able to see. This is the big idea that extends far beyond the North Sea. After the Ice Age, shorelines shifted worldwide, drowning deltas, bays, and continental shelves. If early people favoured coasts for food and travel, then many settlements now lie underwater. Coasts offer shellfish, fish, seabirds, and easy movement along the shore, which makes them natural hubs. They also offer visibility, because you can read weather and seasons from the sea. Underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and unevenly distributed across nations. That means the global record is not only incomplete, it is systematically skewed toward inland and arid places. The absence of evidence near coasts is often a sampling problem, not proof of absence. Even when sites are found, they can be fragile, threatened by trawling, dredging, and erosion. The sea is not a stable museum. It is an active environment. Doggerland becomes a case study in how science recovers what the sea hides. Seismic grids provide the skeleton of the landscape, cores provide the timeline, and artifacts provide human touch. Each line of evidence is partial, but together they make the drowned world legible. The process is a kind of translation, turning sound echoes and microscopic grains into a story of rivers and lives. It is also a reminder that discovery can be incremental, built from many small confirmations. The story also reframes what we mean by ruins, because not every society builds in stone. A Mesolithic camp can be complex and consequential, yet leave only scatters of flint and altered soils. When those traces are submerged and dispersed, the past can look emptier than it was. We are trained to look for walls and foundations, but wetlands preserve different signatures, organic debris, darkened hearth soils, and subtle patterns of discard. If we only value what looks monumental, we misunderstand what humans are. Doggerland is awe-inspiring precisely because it is ordinary in its mechanism. It shows how a habitable plain can become seabed through processes we can measure today. It suggests that many lost civilizations are not hidden by secrecy, but by physics. Sea level rise is not a villain with intent, yet its outcomes are decisive. The ocean simply follows gravity and heat, and the shoreline obeys. So the chapter ends with a shift in scale from one drowned homeland to a global pattern. If sea level rise erased Doggerland, it likely erased other coastal worlds with equal efficiency. The deep past may be richest where we cannot easily dig, and that should change our confidence. What else do we assume never existed simply because it lies beyond our reach? What stories would our own cities tell if the sea covered them and scattered their fragments? From drowned lowlands, the countdown moves to a place that seems like the opposite of a seabed. We turn from the North Sea to a desert plateau, where stone circles and cattle burials hint at a green Sahara. There, forgotten skywatchers may have tracked seasons when the desert was still grassland. From drowned lowlands, the countdown moves to a place that seems like the opposite of a seabed. Egypt's western desert holds Nabta Playa, where stone and sky preserve a prehistory older than dynastic Egypt. The camera rises over pale gravel plains and dark basalt ridges, then drops into a shallow basin, quiet, wind-scoured, and deceptively precise. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but deserts can keep older archives intact. Sand abrades, yet it also seals. In arid air, organic decay slows, and stone stays where it was set. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what do these alignments reveal about planning, knowledge, and survival? What kind of society invests in geometry when it owns no cities and leaves no ink? Today the region reads as empty, yet the emptiness is recent in geological terms. The Sahara is often imagined as timeless, but its boundaries breathe with climate, expanding and contracting across millennia. During the African humid period, roughly 9,000 to 5,000 BCE, the Sahara repeatedly turned green. Not a thin ribbon of life, but broad savannas where grasses, shrubs, and scattered trees could hold the soil. The driver was not magic, but shifting monsoon belts tied to Earth's orbital rhythms. Over thousands of years, precession and tilt alter where summer sunlight is strongest, and that changes how land and ocean heat. As summer insolation increased, the West African monsoon pushed northward, carrying moisture deep into the desert. Warmed land drew in humid air, and convection built towering storm clouds that broke over basins now known only as sand. Rainfall did not fall evenly, and that unevenness shaped human strategy. In some years, storms arrived in pulses, separated by long dry stretches that tested every herd and every family. Seasonal downpours filled basins, groundwater rose, and playa lakes formed where runoff could collect and linger. The word playa sounds static, yet it describes a surface that can flip from cracked clay to shallow water in days. Nabta Playa was one of those basins, a shallow lake that appeared and vanished with the seasons. In wet years it expanded into a reliable watering place, and in dry years it shrank back to dust. From above, the basin would have looked like a temporary mirror, catching the sky at dawn and turning copper at sunset. Along its margins, fresh grass would have erupted first, creating a narrow green band that animals could smell from far away. This climate backdrop matters because it turns a desert mystery into a landscape problem. When water is periodic, life must synchronize with windows of grass, grazing, and safe travel. The timing is unforgiving, because a misjudged departure can strand people between waterholes, with heat and distance doing the killing. In such a system, knowledge is not optional, and memory becomes as valuable as meat. People came to Nabta Playa because it worked as a node in a wider seasonal circuit. Pastoral groups could move herds toward fresh pasture, then return when the basin refilled. The routes were not random wandering, but patterned movement across known terrain, guided by wells, vegetation, and the remembered behavior of storms. Even in a green Sahara, the best places were limited, and limited places create meetings. The evidence is not a city mound, and it is not a drowned shoreline scatter. It is a ritual landscape built from stones, burials, and repeated gatherings that left durable geometry. Imagine arriving after weeks of travel, dust on skin, hides creaking, animals restless, then seeing stones already standing, marking a place where others will also arrive. The basin becomes a calendar made visible, a destination that tells you are not alone. Archaeologists date key features to the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, long before pharaonic temples. Radiocarbon ranges, stratigraphy, and artifact associations anchor the sequence even without texts. Charcoal fragments, bone collagen, and the residues of ancient hearths carry measurable isotopes, and those measurements translate into time. Layer by layer, the site shows episodes of use, abandonment, and return, like a tide of people following a tide of rain. Stone circles appear among the most discussed elements, arranged with deliberate spacing and sightlines. They are not huge by later standards, yet their smallness is part of the point, because precision does not require size. Some stones sit like teeth in a ring, with gaps that feel intentional when you stand at the centre. Nearby stand alignments of larger stones, set in lines that point toward specific horizon positions. The lines pull the eye outward, away from the basin floor, toward distant ridges where the sun rises and sets. Tumuli stone-covered features add another layer of intent, suggesting burial, memorial, or territorial marking. These are not casual piles, because the stones were carried, selected and placed, sometimes over prepared pits. The landscape reads as designed, not accidental, and design implies coordination across families. It also implies rules: who may build, where to build, and what must be remembered when the builders are gone. Here the tension begins because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. Monumentality and measurement appear in a place and time we once labelled as simple wandering. The old story said complexity requires farms, then villages, then cities, then temples. Nabta Playa asks whether ritual and planning can arrive earlier, riding on mobility rather than replacing it. Archaeoastronomy enters as both tool and trap, because alignments can be real and still be overinterpreted. A line of stones can point somewhere meaningful, yet meaning is not automatically provable. The sky offers many targets, and human eyes are good at finding patterns, especially after the fact, so the method has to be disciplined, and the claims have to stay proportional to the evidence. Researchers test alignments by measuring azimuths, horizon altitude, and likely ancient sky positions. They compare these to solstices, equinoxes, and the risings of bright seasonal stars. Those calculations must also account for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts star positions over millennia. A star that rose at a particular notch in 6000 BCE will not rise there today, and that mismatch can either clarify intent or expose coincidence. Some configurations plausibly reference summer solstice sunrise, the moment that can bracket the return of rains. In this latitude, the solstice sun rises at an extreme point on the horizon, and that extreme is repeatable year after year. Other alignments may track stars whose heliacal rising once signalled seasonal change in this latitude. Heliacal rising is a technical phrase, but the idea is simple: the first dawn appearance of a star after it has been lost in the sun's glare. For people living by pasture, that first reappearance is not poetry, it is a clock. It tells you that the sky has reached a known position in its annual cycle, and the land will soon follow. The prediction is not perfect because storms can fail, but even a probabilistic warning is powerful. It turns waiting into planning and planning into survival. But archaeoastronomy cannot read minds, and it cannot recover lost stories by geometry alone. Chance alignments exist, stones can be moved, and later reuse can overwrite earlier intent. A circle can be repaired, expanded, or repurposed, and each change can shift a sightline by degrees. Even erosion matters, because a horizon ridge can soften, and a stone can tilt, and the measured angle becomes a moving target. The strongest claims therefore stay narrow and testable, focused on repeated patterns across features. When multiple lines converge on similar horizon events, coincidence becomes less likely, and planning becomes more plausible. Statistical caution matters here, because the desert is full of rocks, and the human brain is eager to connect them. Yet when the same kinds of alignments recur, and when they appear within a coherent ritual setting, the argument gains weight. Even then, the conclusion is not that these people built an observatory like a modern one. The conclusion is that horizon watching could be embedded in ritual, travel planning, and herd management. You do not need instruments to do this, only fixed reference points and a community that returns often enough to compare. A notch in a ridge, a standing stone, and a remembered date can become a working calendar. In a monsoon-driven savanna, anticipating the rains is not abstract curiosity. It is the difference between grass and dust, between milk and hunger, between safe routes and lethal distances. Cattle cannot graze on hope, and people cannot drink predictions. So the question becomes practical. How do you coordinate movement across a wide landscape when the landscape itself is seasonal? This is proto-science in the strictest sense, because it links observation to prediction. A community can watch the sky, correlate it with storms, then teach the pattern as practical knowledge. The teaching would not look like a classroom, but it could be embedded in story, song, and repeated demonstration. Each year's gathering becomes a test, and each test refines the shared model of how the world behaves. A shared calendar does not require writing, but it does require agreement and enforcement. That enforcement can be social, expressed through gatherings that reset time, roles, and obligations. If the group decides that a certain sunrise marks departure, then leaving early becomes a breach, not just a mistake. In that way, the calendar becomes law, and law becomes a technology for reducing conflict. Nabta Playa's ceremonial complexes suggest exactly that kind of social technology. People meet, perform, bury, and mark moments, then leave with synchronized expectations about the coming season. The visuals linger on footprints in dust, on hearth stains, on worked stone and pottery fragments catching light. Each trace is small, yet together they imply repetition, and repetition implies a schedule. Pastoral complexity is visible in the central role of cattle, an animal that is both wealth and risk. Herding requires breeding control, grazing decisions, and coordinated movement to prevent loss. A herd is a living bank account, but it is also a moving obligation that must be watered, guarded, and healed. Diseases, predators, and drought all press on the system, and the system responds with planning. Cattle burials and ritual deposits indicate that animals were not only food units, they were symbols of status, lineage, and collective survival, worthy of costly ceremonial treatment. To bury a valuable animal is to declare that value is not only edible, but social and spiritual. It is also to declare that the group can afford to think beyond today's hunger, at least in certain moments. A cattle burial is an economic sacrifice, and sacrifice signals authority. Someone must persuade others that giving up value now will protect value later through cohesion and shared timing. That persuasion might come from elders who remember droughts, or from ritual specialists who manage the drama of the gathering. It might also come from consensus, because a group that has suffered together can choose costly unity over cheap division. That persuasion can create leaders without palaces, because leadership can be situational and ceremonial. Ritual specialists, elders, or skilled herders can gain influence by managing uncertainty. Their power is not enforced by walls, but by credibility, and credibility is earned through accurate timing and successful coordination. When the rains arrive after the predicted horizon event, authority becomes visible, and the social system tightens. Without writing, memory becomes infrastructure, and ceremony becomes a storage device. Repeated rites encode when to move, when to gather, and who owes cooperation when conditions turn harsh. The desert does not forgive improvisation, so the group builds reliability into performance. A chant can carry a sequence, a procession can mark a direction, and a stone can pin a moment to the ground. This is the series argument in a new environment, where stone and starlight do the archiving. Civilization didn't begin with writing, it began wherever humans learned to coordinate, remember, and reshape their world. Nabta Playa makes that claim feel physical, because the stones still stand where coordination once happened. The site is not a metaphor, it is a mechanism, one that worked because people returned and agreed. Nabta Playa also forces a correction to how we imagine early North Africa. The Sahara was not always a barrier, and during humid phases it could be a corridor of grasslands and lakes. Rock art across the region shows animals and scenes that fit a wetter world, hinting at the lived reality behind the climate curves. When the land is passable, ideas move with people, and people move with herds. That corridor would have connected groups across wide distances, spreading styles, livestock practices, and ritual ideas. Mobility in a green Sahara can generate networks as real as later river trade. The network is not a single road, but a shifting web of seasonal routes where certain basins become hubs. In such hubs, strangers become partners, marriages link lineages, and shared ceremonies stabilize exchange. As the African humid period waned after about 5000 BCE, the monsoon retreated southward again. Lakes shrank, vegetation thinned, and the Sahara began its long return to hyperaridity. The visuals change with the climate, from green patches and water reflections to widening salt flats and dust devils. What was once a reliable basin becomes an uncertainty, then an absence. Drying did not happen in one clean step, and people did not vanish overnight. They adjusted routes, concentrated near remaining water, and increasingly oriented toward the Nile's dependable flow. The Nile is not just a river, but a linear oasis, fed by distant rains and highland sources beyond the desert's reach. In a drying continent, that reliability becomes magnetic. pulling people and practices toward its banks. This is where the continuity debate begins, and it must stay cautious. Similarities between desert ritual and later Nile traditions may reflect contact, convergence, or shared deep roots. It is tempting to draw a straight arrow from stones in the desert to temples on the river, because the human mind loves clean origins. But prehistory is rarely clean, and influence often travels in fragments. Some researchers point to cattle symbolism, ceremonial authority, and sky-linked timing as possible threads. Others warn that parallels can be generic, and that direct ancestry is hard to demonstrate. Cattle matter in many pastoral societies, and the sky matters wherever seasons matter, so resemblance alone cannot settle the question. The evidence has to be weighed, not wished into place. The honest position is that Nabta Playa shows capacities that later Egypt also required. It demonstrates planning, calendrical concern, and ritual governance, without proving a single straight line of origin. In other words, it shows that the ingredients existed in the region, and that people could assemble them under the right conditions. Whether those exact groups became later populations is a separate, harder claim. Continuity can be cultural without being genealogical, and influence can be indirect. People displaced by drying climates can carry ideas into new settings, where they recombine with local traditions. A calendar concept can survive even if the original stones are abandoned, because the concept can be taught, adapted, and renamed. The desert may erase roots, but it does not erase what people remember when they migrate. The larger claim is environmental, not dynastic. Climate cycles can create windows for complexity, then close them, forcing migration and reinvention rather than simple collapse. That pattern is visible across the Holocene, and it's visible here in miniature, written into the basin's alternating layers. The question is not why people failed, but how they responded when the rules changed. Nabta Playa's disappearance is therefore not a failure of intelligence, but a loss of habitat. When the rains moved, the ceremonial landscape lost its practical anchor, and gatherings had to relocate. A calendar tied to a particular horizon still works, but only if people can safely reach the horizon marker. When the journey becomes too risky, the social machine breaks, and the stones become leftovers. The stones remain because deserts preserve what wetlands and coasts erase. Yet preservation can mislead, because it isolates monuments from the living networks that once gave them meaning. We see the endpoint, not the process, and we mistake survival for importance. So we have to imagine the missing parts. The voices, the negotiations, the arguments over when to leave. So the central question tightens again in the middle of the series. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what do these sky-aligned stones reveal about advanced societies that disappeared? Do they reveal a lost first Egypt, or do they reveal something more unsettling? That complexity can rise wherever conditions allow, then vanish without leaving a name. They reveal a society that measured time to manage risk, and used ritual to coordinate action. They reveal that astronomy can be a survival tool, not a mystical hobby. The sky, in this telling, is not distant, because it directly governs grass, water, and movement. Watching the horizon becomes a way of watching the future. They also reveal how fragile early complexity can be when it depends on rain belts. A shifting monsoon can erase an entire way of life, leaving only alignments that still point to the sun. The stones keep their direction even when the reason for gathering is gone, and that is why they feel haunting. They are accurate and they are alone. From here, the countdown follows the Nile south and east into Africa's earliest urban experiments. In the Sahel, cities rose earlier than many people imagine Africa had them. The river becomes a corridor again, and the next chapter follows that corridor into places where coordination hardens into streets, walls, and permanent power. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but West Africa keeps older chapters in harder code: clay, slag, charcoal, and the stubborn logic of layers. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, Nock asks what technology and art can prove without names, dates in ink, or a single royal chronicle. We are in what is now central Nigeria, in a forest, savanna mosaic shaped by rainfall and fire, where green thickets give way to grass and scattered trees. In the wet season, water rushes through shallow soils and gullies, and in the dry season, heat and wind open the ground again. The landscape grows fast, decays fast, and hides evidence fast, which makes absence a dangerous argument, especially when we're tempted to treat silence as proof. Later at rich earth stains, tools read as excavators cut neat squares into the ground, and every scraped centimetre can matter. A single storm can rearrange sediments, and a single root can pierce a layer like a needle through fabric. In such a setting, the past does not sit politely in place, and archaeology becomes a discipline of patience. Nok is not a single city, and it is not a royal dynasty with a carved king list. It is a culture recognised through material patterns, spread across many sites and many generations, which means its boundaries are drawn by evidence rather than by a map. What holds the label together is repetition. Recurring sculptural forms, recurring technical choices, and recurring traces of production. The broad chronology runs from about 1500 BCE to about 300 CE, with regional variation and uneven sampling that can exaggerate gaps. That long span matters because it overlaps the first millennium BCE, when iron reshaped economies across Afro-Eurasia and changed what everyday labour could accomplish. It also matters because it forces a question. How does a tradition persist for centuries without leaving texts, stone palaces, or monumental inscriptions? Dating Nok is difficult because tropical soils recycle organic matter and destroy bone, wood, and fibre before they can become stable archives. Termites, roots, acidity, and wet seasons break down the very materials that usually anchor archaeological time, and they do it with relentless efficiency. Even when charcoal survives, it can be moved by burrowing animals or washed into older layers, and that movement can turn certainty into debate. So chronology relies on stratified contexts, careful excavation, and multiple dating tools that cross-check each other rather than standing alone. Radiocarbon dates charcoal and other carbon-bearing remains by measuring the decay of carbon-14, which ticks down at a known rate after an organism dies. Thermoluminescence dates fired clay by measuring trapped energy released as light, which resets when an object is heated and then accumulates again over time. These methods are powerful, but they are not magic, and the difference between a strong date and a weak one is often context. A charcoal fleck in a disturbed layer can be older than the event it seems to date, and a fired fragment can be redeposited far from its original use. The best chronology is therefore built like a bridge. Many supports, each tested, each compared against the others. Stratigraphy is the discipline that keeps these methods honest, because layers record sequence even when artifacts are scattered. Soil changes in colour, texture, and compaction can mark different episodes of deposition, and those subtle changes become a timeline in Earth. A terracotta head found in a sealed layer means more than the same head pulled from a looter's pit, because the sealed layer preserves relationships. Those relationships are the real data: what lies above, what lies below, what lies beside, and what lies within the same occupational surface. A hearth suggests cooking or craft, a cluster of sherds suggests breakage in place, and a line of post holes suggests a structure that has otherwise vanished. In a humid zone, sequence is often all we have, so sequence must be protected. Here the tension begins because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. The Nok record is thin in places, yet the surviving fragments imply organised production and technical knowledge, and they do so repeatedly. Each new find is both a gift and a warning, because it arrives already damaged by time. Nok is famous for terracotta sculpture that looks instantly distinctive once you learn its grammar, like a language that announces itself through accent and rhythm. Many figures are hollow, built from coils or slabs, then modelled, detailed, and fired with controlled heat that had to be judged by eye. In close light, the clay surface can show smoothing marks, joins, and deliberate textures, which reveal hands at work rather than anonymous miracles. Faces often show pierced pupils, carefully shaped mouths, and elaborate hair or headdress forms that rise in ridges, buns, or patterned caps. Noses can be broad and strong, and ears can be exaggerated into clear geometric planes, as if the sculptor wanted features to read at a distance. Limbs and torsos can be stylized, yet the style repeats across sites enough to suggest shared training, shared standards, and shared expectations. The pierced eyes are not only a visual signature, they are also a technical decision that reduces stress during firing. Small openings allow moisture and expanding air to escape, which lowers the risk of cracking as temperature rises. Even the aesthetics carry engineering, which is why the sculptures feel like both art and proof. Hollow construction is not only an artistic choice, it is a technical solution to firing large forms. Thick solid clay can crack or explode, So hollow bodies and venting show practical understanding of heat and moisture, learned through trial and costly failure. To fire a large hollow piece, you must control drying time, manage wall thickness, and keep temperature changes gradual. The firing itself implies infrastructure, because clay must be heated beyond simple campfire temperatures to become durable ceramic. Whether in open firing or in more controlled kiln-like settings, the process demands fuel, planning, and a practiced sense of timing. The visual we imagine is not a lone artist, but a working space, stacks of drying forms, ash underfoot, and smoke drifting into trees. Consistency implies workshops, apprenticeships, and rules about how a figure should be made, even if the rules were never written down. A tradition that's stable requires teachers, time, and social value that justifies repeated labour, because clay is heavy and firing is risky. When a style persists across generations, it usually means the community is investing in memory. That investment raises questions that the objects can only hint at. Who commissioned these works, and who had the authority to decide what a face should look like? Were certain forms reserved for certain roles? Or did the style serve as a shared emblem across many households? The sculptures also imply social meaning that we can only infer through context and distribution. They may mark ancestors, status, ritual roles, or community identity, but looting has stripped many pieces of their setting and flattened their stories. When context survives, it can show whether a figure was placed in a domestic area, a refuse deposit, or a special purpose space. When a terracotta is removed without notes, the story collapses into a single object, isolated and mute. Archaeology is not treasure hunting, because the data is the relationship between things, not the things alone, and that distinction is not academic. Without association, we cannot test whether a sculpture was used in life, broken in ritual, or buried deliberately after a ceremony. Knock terracottas became targets for illicit excavation, especially as global markets rewarded rarity and rewarded the illusion of timelessness. Looters dig fast, break stratigraphy, and discard the small fragments that could have dated and explained the whole, because fragments do not sell. The camera lingers on a torn pit wall, fresh cuts through ancient layers, like a book ripped mid-sentence. That damage is not abstract because it changes what scholars can responsibly claim. Without context, a sculpture can be authentic and still be almost useless for reconstructing Knock life, economy, and chronology. Authenticity is not the same as evidence, and the market often confuses the two. Against that fragile archive stands the other Knock headline, which is iron. The question is not whether iron existed, but when it began and whether Knock communities smelted it locally, repeatedly, and at scale. Iron is heavy, practical, and transformative, so its presence changes how we imagine daily work. Ironworking matters because it is a threshold technology that changes tools, farming, and warfare, even when production is small. Iron axes and hoes can clear tougher vegetation, and iron blades can hold sharper edges than many stone alternatives. It also requires high heat, specialized knowledge, and repeated practice that tends to cluster in skilled groups, because mistakes waste fuel and ore. The basic process is bloomery smelting, which reduces iron ore in a furnace using charcoal as both fuel and chemical agent. Air is forced in through tuyères, raising temperature and controlling chemistry inside the furnace shaft, where oxygen must be managed rather than simply added. In plain terms, smelting is controlled transformation. Rock becomes metal because the furnace environment is engineered. Charcoal matters here because it burns hotter and cleaner than raw wood, and because it can create the carbon monoxide needed for reduction. Producing it requires slow burning under limited oxygen, which is itself a technical craft tied to woodland knowledge. Before iron becomes a tool, it becomes a supply chain. The product is a bloom, a spongy mass of iron and slag that must be hammered and refined, sometimes repeatedly, to drive out impurities. Slag is the glassy waste that forms when impurities combine with fluxes and melt away from metal, and it can preserve chemical fingerprints of the process. Under light, slag can look like dark lava, bubbled and sharp-edged, the fossil of a high-temperature event. After smelting, smithing begins, and smithing has its own rhythm, reheating, hammering, folding, and shaping. A bloom can contain pockets of slag and uneven carbon content, so the smith must work the metal until it becomes reliable. This is why ironworking is not a single invention, but a chain of skills, each depending on the last. So what counts as proof of local production rather than imported finished iron? Archaeologists look for furnaces, slag heaps, tuyere fragments, ore sources, and spatial patterns that show repeated smelting at a site, not just isolated use. They also look for repair debris, hammer-scale slag droplets, and fragments of furnace lining that break under heat. A single iron object proves use, but it does not prove smelting, and that distinction is central to the NOC debate. Smelting leaves heavy debris, and heavy debris usually stays near where it was made because it is not worth carrying. When slag appears in quantity, it is a signature of production, not consumption. In NOC regions, researchers have recovered slag, tuyeres, and furnace remains that suggest on-site metallurgy, and in some cases the material appears in patterns consistent with repeated activity. Some evidence has been argued to date early, potentially into the 1st millennium BCE, though dates and associations are debated and must be handled carefully. The argument is not only about pride or priority, it is about whether the chain of evidence is secure. The debate is partly technical and partly about standards of proof in difficult preservation conditions. If charcoal is intrusive or layers are mixed, a radiocarbon date can attach to the wrong event, and the error can look convincing. A furnace can also be reused, repaired or cut by later pits, which complicates what a single sample represents. Thermoluminescence can date fired furnace wall fragments or terracottas, but it also requires secure sampling and clear association with the event we think we're dating. The best cases combine multiple dates with clean stratigraphy and consistent artifact assemblages, so the story does not hang on one number. In good practice, each date is treated as a clue, not a verdict. Another debate sits behind the dates, which is independent invention versus diffusion. Did iron smelting emerge locally in West Africa, or arrive through contact with North Africa and the Mediterranean world, carried by traders, migrants, or itinerant specialists? The question is older than NOC research itself, and it has often been shaped by assumptions about where innovation is allowed to happen. Diffusion is plausible because trade routes and ideas move, even without writing, and because small-scale contact can transmit big techniques. Independent invention is plausible because the raw materials exist, and similar problems can produce similar solutions, especially when communities experiment with fire and minerals. Either way, the key point is agency. People in this landscape made choices, tested methods, and taught skills. NOC does not need to be the single origin point to be historically important, and it does not need to be the earliest to be profound. The point is that West Africa was not a passive receiver of technology, and the evidence demands a more distributed map of innovation, with multiple centres and multiple timelines. When we widen the map, the old story of a single pipeline of progress begins to fail. Iron also complicates simplistic cradle stories that centre a few river valleys and treat other regions as late. NOC suggests that complex knowledge can arise in places where preservation is worst and archives are thinnest, which means our confidence is partly a product of geology. If stone survives and wood rots, then stone-rich regions will always look louder than they were. Settlement patterns deepen that challenge, because NOC societies may be archaeologically quiet while socially complex. In a humid zone, architecture is often wood, thatch and earth, which vanish unless burned or sealed, leaving only stains and post holes. The camera can hover over a grid of excavated squares where nothing monumental appears, yet the soil is full of subtle signals. A community can be dense, organised, and long-lived, yet leave little stone footprint. If we only count walls and palaces, we will misread the tropics as empty, and we will mistake preservation for absence. What would a capital look like if it were built from materials designed to return to the ground? Evidence points to agriculture and food production adapted to the forest, savanna edge, where soils, rainfall and vegetation shift over short distances. Farming, gathering and herding strategies likely shifted with rainfall, soils and seasonal mobility, because the calendar of work follows the calendar of water. Even small changes in season length can change planting decisions, storage needs and movement. The forest, savanna mosaic, is not a background, it is a constraint and an opportunity, and it rewards people who can read it closely. It offers diverse resources, but it also demands flexible movement and knowledge of microenvironments, from gallery forests along streams to open grassland patches. In such a landscape, expertise is not only technical, it is ecological. Mobility does not mean simplicity, because mobility can be structured and coordinated across families and generations. Seasonal circuits can link communities, move goods, and spread styles without building permanent stone centres, and those circuits can be as regulated as roads. When people move predictably, they create networks that can carry both objects and ideas. Trade is difficult to reconstruct when organic containers decay and perishable goods vanish, leaving only the durable leftovers. Still, the spread of terracotta style and metallurgical practice implies networks that carried skills and materials and perhaps also carried stories. A shared sculptural grammar across distance is a kind of map, one drawn in clay rather than ink. Iron production also implies charcoal production, which ties metallurgy to woodland management and to the labour of cutting, stacking, and controlled burning. Charcoal requires controlled burning and labour, and it can reshape local landscapes over time, especially if demand is steady. The ecological footprint of iron is therefore part of its history, even when the trees are gone. If Nok iron working was extensive, it would have required organised fuel supply and repeated technical training, because furnaces do not feed themselves. That kind of system suggests specialists, whether full-time or seasonal, embedded in wider community obligations and exchange. Specialisation does not require kings, but it does require coordination and trust. Terracotta workshops and smelting areas also imply places of learning, where novices watched experts and repeated tasks until the body remembered. Apprenticeship is a social institution, because skill must be transmitted reliably across generations, and because errors are expensive in fuel and time. The continuity of style and technique suggests that teaching was not casual, it was expected. We return to the central question, because Nok forces us to define civilization without writing, and without the comfort of named rulers. If advanced societies can be built from perishable houses, oral memory, and technical craft, then the archive is biased by climate, and the bias is systematic. What else have we missed simply because the ground is too alive? This is the same warning Doggerland delivered through sea level rise, now delivered through tropical decay, and it is just as unforgiving. What disappears is not only objects, but the kinds of objects that would have proven everyday complexity, like baskets, textiles, wooden tools, and stored food. The past can be sophisticated and still be made of materials that do not last. Archaeologists therefore rely on the few durable traces that survive, and they must treat them as partial rather than complete. A terracotta head is not the whole society, and a slag heap is not the whole economy, even when they are spectacular. The discipline is a constant negotiation between what we can see and what we must infer. The ethical crisis of looting makes that partial record even thinner, and it does so in a way that cannot be repaired. Illicit digging does not merely steal art, it destroys the relationships that allow science to test claims, and it destroys them quickly. A looted pit is not only a hole in the ground, it is a hole in the timeline. Museums and collectors can unintentionally reward that destruction when they buy unprovenance pieces, even when they believe they are saving them. The result is a market that converts context into cash and turns knowledge into rumour, because the object is detached from the evidence that explains it. The most damaging theft is not the sculpture itself, but the information that dies with its removal. Responsible work means excavation with local collaboration, legal protection, and transparent publication that allows others to evaluate the claims. It also means acknowledging uncertainty where context has been lost, even when the objects are spectacular and the temptation to overstate is strong. In a fragile archive, humility is part of rigour. Nok's story is therefore both awe and warning, because it shows brilliance and fragility at once. A culture can master fire, clay, and metal, yet still be nearly invisible in the long record, because invisibility can be an artifact of environment. When the ground erases, it erases indiscriminately. Why did Nok change or disappear by around 300 CE, and why is the end so hard to narrate? Climate shifts, social reorganisation, migration, and changing trade networks are possible, but the evidence is incomplete and the transitions are subtle. An ending in archaeology is often not a collapse, but a reconfiguration that our categories fail to track. The more honest conclusion is that Nok did not vanish into nothing, but transformed into later West African histories we cannot neatly connect with the data we have. Without texts, continuity can be real and still be hard to prove, because styles evolve and technologies travel. The question becomes not, where did they go, but how did they become something else? Nok challenges the idea that innovation belongs to a few places, and it challenges the idea that monuments are required for complexity. It also shows how quickly knowledge can be erased when the archive is soil and rain, and when modern demand accelerates the loss. If the past is fragile, then the present has a responsibility. Civilization didn't begin with writing. It began wherever humans learned to coordinate, remember, and reshape their world across generations. Nok reshaped its world with kilns, furnaces, and a sculptural language that still feels alive, even when we cannot hear the names behind it. The faces in clay look outward across centuries, asking what we think counts as proof. Now the countdown pivots across an ocean to a different kind of durability. We cross the Atlantic to the Andes, where cities and surgery appear at shocking antiquity, carved into high-altitude stone and preserved by cold air and rock. There, the archive is not clay and slag in fragile soils, but architecture that grips the mountains. The question remains the same, and the evidence becomes harder, higher, and older than expected, as if the planet itself is changing the medium of memory. Where Nok asks us to read the faintest traces in living soil, the Andes will ask us to read stone that refuses to forget. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but Peru's coast keeps older ledges in sand and stone. Caral, Supe, also called Norte Chico, forces the central question into a new hemisphere. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what do planned cities prove without a single readable word? The camera lingers on pale desert ridges and river-green ribbons, an ancient landscape that still looks unfinished, as if the builders just stepped away. We're on an arid strip between ocean and Andes, where rivers cut green corridors through desert. The Humboldt Current chills the Pacific, feeding plankton blooms that can turn the sea into a living pantry. Inland, the Andean wall catches moisture and releases it as seasonal flow, so valleys become narrow laboratories of survival. In this narrow zone, preservation can be brutally selective, and that selectivity shapes what we think we know. Wooden fibre can survive when buried dry, while rainfall would have erased them elsewhere. That accident of climate is why this chapter exists at all, because the desert behaves like a vault until modern disturbance breaks the seal. Caral Supe is not one city, and it is not a lone ceremonial mound. It is a network of centres spread across several valleys, linked by routes, exchange, and shared building grammar. Aerial views reveal repeated patterns, platforms, plazas, and aligned ramps, appearing like a sentence written across multiple floodplains. The scale matters because networks imply coordination beyond a single lineage or village. A civilization can be distributed and still be organised, especially when its power depends on moving goods and labour between ecological zones. The headline is time, because the dates land where many viewers do not expect America to be. Major construction peaks roughly 3000 to 1800 BCE, with earlier activity and later reuse at some sites. That places Caral contemporary with early dynastic Egypt and early Sumerian city growth, while the Indus world is still forming. The comparison is not to claim contact, but to reset the global timeline of complexity. It also forces a harder question. How many early experiments in urban life never made it into our standard story? Dating is not a guess based on style, because the region lacks the usual ceramic sequences. Instead, archaeologists lean on radiocarbon dating of plant fibres, reeds, and organic inclusions trapped in construction. In platform mounds, builders used basket loads of gravel and sand as fill, often wrapped in fibre bags. Those bags are more than construction debris. They're snapshots of a workday, sealed under later layers. Their fibres become timestamps if their context is secure, and if the excavation records exactly where each sample came from. Radiocarbon works because living plants absorb carbon, then stop when harvested and die. Carbon-14 decays at a known rate, so measured ratios yield an age range rather than a single date. The range must be calibrated against atmospheric variation, because the amount of carbon-14 in the air has fluctuated over time. Calibration curves translate laboratory measurements into calendar probabilities, and that translation is where uncertainty becomes honest. Context still rules, because a fibre can be intrusive if later burrowing, root growth or repair moved it. Even a careful date can mislead if the sample is not truly tied to the moment of construction. Caral's strongest dates come from sealed fills and construction episodes that stack in clear sequence. When multiple samples from different levels converge, the timeline tightens and confidence rises. Archaeologists look for undisturbed layers, clean contacts, consistent sediment textures, and intact bag clusters that were never reopened. The method is the same logic introduced earlier in the series, now applied to architecture rather than charcoal hearths. Stone remembers, but the fibres inside the stone can tell us when. In the excavation trench, those fibres appear as faint lines and knots, small details carrying enormous chronological weight. Significance follows from what is built, not from what is written. At Caral and neighbouring centres, large platform mounds rise in planned groups, their faces stepped and their volumes calculated. Sunken circular plazas sit in front of major platforms, creating repeated ceremonial layouts that feel both intimate and monumental. From above, the plazas read like deliberate voids, spaces carved out for bodies, sound, and attention. Residential zones cluster around these cores, with variation that hints at social differences. The city is legible as a design system, and design implies rules that people agree to follow. The architecture implies governance, because coordinated building requires decisions that outlast individuals. Someone chose where plazas would sit, how ramps would align, and how much labour would be mobilised. Someone also decided what counted as finished, because monumental projects can be endlessly expanded unless authority defines an endpoint. Work had to be synchronised with seasons, because river agriculture and fishing both have calendars. In a desert valley, timing is not preference, it is survival. Even without palaces, management is visible in the built plan, like fingerprints pressed into the landscape. Labour is the next question, because pyramids are not self-explanatory. Were workers coerced, paid, feasting, or obligated through ritual duty and kin ties? The evidence suggests organised projects repeated over generations, which points to institutions rather than one-time enthusiasm. Construction fill-in standardised bags hints at routines, countable units that can be assigned, delivered and checked. Monumentality is a social technology that converts many small efforts into one enduring form. It also creates a public memory, because a mound is a reminder that coordination happened here and can happen again. Caral Supe complicates the old formula that cities require pottery, armies, and written accounts. Ceramics are scarce or absent in the core early phases, which removes a common marker of settled life. That absence matters because pottery usually carries clues: cooking styles, household storage, trade signatures, and decorative identity. Yet the centres show planning, public space, and large-scale construction. Civilization can be real even when its most durable household goods never existed. The ground plan becomes the artifact, and the city itself becomes the archive. The absence of obvious warfare is another pressure point. Many sites lack defensive walls, mass graves, and clear weapon assemblages in early contexts. That does not prove peace, because conflict can be social, episodic, or archaeologically quiet. Violence can leave few traces if it is rare, if bodies are treated carefully, or if weapons are made of perishable materials. Still, the pattern suggests that coercion by constant warfare is not the only path to state-like coordination. Authority can be built through ritual, redistribution, and control of key resources, power that feels less like conquest and more like management. Economy is where the coast and desert become one machine. Cotton appears as a strategic crop, not mainly for clothing, but for fishing technology. Strong cotton fibre makes nets, lines, and floats that scale up marine harvest, and scaling up changes everything. A hand line feeds a household, but a large net can feed a work crew, a neighbourhood, or a building season. The sea provides anchovy and other small fish in enormous quantities, turning protein into a predictable base. When the ocean is generous, it can underwrite projects that look impossibly ambitious for a desert. This is the core of the Maritime Foundation's hypothesis. The idea is that rich marine resources could support dense populations and leaders even before intensive cereal agriculture. In this model, agriculture supplies crucial complements like cotton, gourds, and some plant foods, while the ocean supplies the bulk calories and protein. The hypothesis challenges old-world expectations built around grain and livestock, where surplus is imagined as fields and herds. Here, surplus may arrive in shimmering schools, pulled from cold water and dried into portable rations. It asks us to picture an early city whose granary is partly the sea. Testing the hypothesis requires more than intuition about a productive ocean. Archaeologists examine middens, the layered trash deposits that record what people actually ate and discarded. Fish bones, shell, plant remains, and soot-stained cooking stones become a diet ledger, and the ledger can be quantified. Analysts identify species, measure bone frequencies, and compare contexts across neighbourhoods and sites. If marine foods dominate consistently, the model gains strength, especially if the pattern holds through time. If inland crops dominate, the model must be revised or at least localised to particular communities. Isotopes add another line of evidence, because bone chemistry reflects long-term diet rather than a single meal. Carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios can separate marine protein from terrestrial sources, since ocean food webs often produce distinct signatures. Nitrogen values tend to rise with trophic level, and marine chains can push those values higher in human collagen. When human remains are available and ethically studied, isotopic signatures can show whether seafood was occasional or foundational. The method is powerful, but it must be tied to local baselines, because arid environments can skew plant signals. A careful study compares humans to local animals and plants, so the chemistry is interpreted in the right ecological language. The emerging picture is mixed but coherent. Marine protein appears central, especially for coastal communities and for exchange into inland valleys. Irrigated agriculture along rivers adds beans, squash, fruits, and other crops, supporting stability and variety. These plants also bring micronutrients and carbohydrates that complement fish-heavy diets, smoothing out seasonal risk. Cotton links the two worlds by enabling larger fishing yields and by becoming a tradable necessity. The economy is not either sea or farm, but a coupled system. When one side thrives, it amplifies the other. When one side falters, the whole network feels it. Irrigation matters because the desert does not forgive casual planting. Rivers are seasonal and variable, and their channels can shift, so canals and field management become tools of survival. The visual is stark, a thin line of water diverted and disciplined, turning dust into green rectangles. Building and maintaining canals requires collective labour and rules about water access. Water scheduling is governance in physical form, because it decides who eats and when. In a dry landscape, control of flow becomes control of life, and disputes over water can be as consequential as battles. Exchange ties the network together, because no single zone has everything. Coastal fish can move inland dried and salted, while inland crops and cotton move toward the shore. Transport does not require wheels to be effective, but it does require planning, paths, packloads, and predictable meeting points. This movement creates obligations and opportunities for leaders to coordinate storage and distribution. Even without coins or writing, redistribution can build power, because it makes leaders the hinge between scarcity and security. The city network becomes an engine that turns geography into hierarchy, and hierarchy becomes visible in who lives closest to the ceremonial core. Ritual is the glue that makes that engine run without constant force. Sunken plazas are not random pits, because they recur as formal public spaces with consistent geometry. They concentrate people, sound, and attention, which makes them ideal for ceremonies that synchronize belief and behavior. Imagine standing at the plaza floor, looking up at concentric walls and the ring of faces above, an architecture built to hold a crowd and hold a moment. Shared ritual can function like a contract that is renewed in public. When everyone witnesses the same performance, memory becomes enforceable, and promises become harder to deny. Music and performance likely played a role, because instruments and sound-related artifacts appear in some contexts. Sound behaves differently in a sunken circle, where walls can reflect and focus voices, drums, and flutes. The point is not to romanticize, but to note that coordination needs media. In societies without texts, rhythm, repetition, and spectacle can carry schedules and obligations. A ceremony can encode who owes labor, who receives goods, and when the next gathering occurs. The plaza becomes a stage where administration is felt, not read. Communication without writing is therefore not a void, but a different toolkit. The Andes later developed quipu, knotted cords used for accounting and record-keeping. At Caral, Supe, direct evidence for quipu, is debated and fragmentary, partly because fibre survives unevenly and identification is difficult. Even when cords survive, proving their administrative function is harder than simply finding them. Still, the possibility matters because administration can exist as tactile data. A knot can be a number, a category, or a record of obligation. information stored in touch and pattern. Even without quipu, tally systems can be simple and effective. Knotted strings, counted bundles, marked sticks, and standardized containers can track labor and goods, especially when auditing is public. A leader does not need to write 200 bags of fill if 200 identical bags are stacked in view. Memory specialists can hold genealogies, quotas, and ritual calendars, trained to recite and verify. Oral systems can be rigorous when social penalties enforce accuracy and when repetition is built into public life. Writing is one solution, not the definition of administration, and the desert's silence does not mean the society lacked records. The chapter's stakes rise here, because Caral, Supe forces a redefinition of what early civilization looks like. Monumental architecture appears without pottery, without clear warfare, and without confirmed writing. The series' argument tightens because the absence of familiar markers no longer excuses dismissal. Civilization didn't begin with writing, it began wherever humans learned to coordinate, remember, and reshape their world. The unsettling thought is that our categories may be narrower than the past itself. So what else have we missed? Caral Supe also exposes how fragile our global narrative is, because it was nearly invisible until recently. Part of the reason is scholarly focus, because later Andean cultures dominated attention and left more obvious artifacts. Chavin, Moche, Nazca, Wari, Tiwanaku, and Inca created spectacular remains that pulled the spotlight uphill and forward in time. Their ceramics, metals, and iconography shout across centuries, while earlier coastal mounds whisper in earth tones. Earlier coastal platforms looked like natural hills or later debris until systematic survey and excavation corrected the map. Once the map changed, the timeline had to change with it. Another reason is that Caral, Supe's key technologies, are perishable. Cotton nets, reed mats, wooden tools, and cordage do not survive in many climates, and even here they survive unevenly. When they decay, the economic logic becomes harder to see, and the society can be misread as smaller than it was. A net is a factory, but it leaves little trace once the fibers rot. This is the same bias the series has tracked across drowned coasts and tropical soils. The archive favours stone and punishes fibre, even when fibre ran the economy, and that bias can distort what we call advanced. Preservation is also a paradox on the Peruvian coast. Desert dryness can protect architecture and organic remains when buried, keeping context readable for millennia. Yet the same flat valleys attract modern roads, farms, and urban expansion, because the geography that once supported canals now supports development. Development can cut canals, level mounds, and remove the very layers that carry the radiocarbon fibres. The past can survive 4,000 years, then vanish in one construction season. In a drone shot, the contrast is sharp. Ancient platforms on one side, modern grid lines on the other, separated by only a thin fence. So protection becomes part of the story, not an afterthought. Archaeology depends on controlled excavation, but it also depends on legal and community choices that keep sites intact. Site management is not only about fences and signs, but about training, funding, and local partnerships that make preservation practical. Looting is less central here than in some regions, yet damage can still be incremental and irreversible. A bulldozer does not only remove dirt, it removes sequence, and sequence is the proof. Without sequence, the dates lose their anchor, and the argument becomes easier to dismiss. Caral, Supe's network, also raises the question of why it changed after about 1800 BCE. The evidence suggests shifts rather than a single dramatic collapse, with some centres declining and others transforming. Climate variability, including El Niño-driven disruptions, could have hit fisheries and river flows. El Niño can warm coastal waters, disrupt upwelling, and push fish populations away from shore. It can also bring floods that tear canals apart, or droughts that reduce the flow to a trickle. If anchovy yields crashed or canals silted, the coupled sea farm system would strain. In a tightly coordinated economy, shocks propagate fast because dependence is efficient until it becomes fragile. Social reorganisation is another plausible driver because networks can reroute. New centres can rise along different valleys, and authority can migrate with trade and ritual. A plaza abandoned is not always a failure, because people may simply choose a new focal point, a new lineage, or a new bargain. Without writing, these transitions leave no official explanation, only changing building patterns and abandoned plazas. The silence is not emptiness, it is a different kind of ending. Prehistory often ends by becoming something else, and the next chapter is sometimes hidden inside the last renovation layer. What remains undeniable is the proof of planning at a surprising date. Platform mounds required engineering knowledge of stability, drainage, and stage construction, because a poorly packed fill slumps and cracks. Builders had to understand load, slope, and the behaviour of sand and gravel under pressure. Plazas required surveying and shared standards of shape and placement, so the circle stayed true and the entrances aligned. Residential zoning suggests rules about proximity to ceremonial cores and perhaps about status, craft roles, or ritual access. These are not accidental outcomes of scattered households. They are the visible residue of decisions repeated until they became tradition. Caral, Supe therefore becomes a test case for the series' central tension. If complex societies can exist without writing, and if their key tools are perishable, then many early chapters may be missing by default. Some were drowned like Doggerland, some were erased by rain like Nok, and some were overlooked because later empires wrote louder histories. The question is not only what existed, but what our methods are least able to see. When we excavate, we are not just uncovering the past, we are also exposing the blind spots of our own expectations. The chapter closes by widening the lens beyond one coast. The Andes will keep building on these foundations, turning ritual and administration into new forms. Stone will become sharper, joints tighter, and geometry more cosmic, as if the mountains demand a stricter language. The next step in the countdown climbs from sea-level deserts into high altitude, where cold air preserves precision and power reshapes entire landscapes. The camera lifts toward the dark spine of the Andes, peaks catching light, valleys dropping into shadow, hinting at a different kind of monumentality. From here, we move deeper into the Andes to a high-altitude ritual capital, where stone precision and cosmic geometry remake the mountain world. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but the Andes keep other ledgers in stone. Tiwanaku forces the central question higher, because its builders left no indigenous script, yet they left engineering that still argues back. When you stand among the cut blocks, you feel the strange inversion. Paper is absent, but planning is everywhere. We are near Lake Titicaca on the Altiplano, where thin air punishes bodies and crops. The plateau sits above 3,800 meters, and every decision must negotiate cold nights, short growing seasons, and sudden drought. In the morning light, the land looks gentle, yet the wind carries a dry bite that never quite leaves. Even walking becomes a calculation, because oxygen is scarce and fatigue arrives early. Lake Titicaca itself complicates the scene, because it is both a boundary and a resource. The water reflects a hard blue sky, and the shoreline shifts with seasons and longer climate swings. At this elevation, sunlight is intense and shadows are sharp, an unforgiving clarity that makes the ruins feel exposed. It is the kind of place where survival is visible and where failure would be immediate. Tiwanaku rises roughly 500 to 1000 CE, but it does not begin from nothing. Earlier villages, ritual traditions, and regional exchange build a foundation that later becomes a capital with reach. Archaeology sees this continuity in ceramics, in house patterns, and in the slow thickening of occupation layers. What looks sudden in stone is usually gradual in soil. This is why, before recorded history can include later centuries, a society can be historically late, yet still be prehistoric in the strict sense, because it left no local writing that preserves its own voice. The calendar may say medieval, but the archive behaves like deep time. Without texts, we're forced to treat material traces as the primary narrator. Outsiders will later write about the Andes, but that is not the same archive. When records arrive from conquest or distant chroniclers, they filter memory through power, translation, and agendas. Even honest observers misunderstand what they cannot contextualize, and they often rename what they cannot pronounce. So the written record becomes a second layer, not a clean window. So Tiwanaku must be read the way this series has trained us to read. We use stratigraphy, radiocarbon, ceramics, and paleoclimate proxies. Then we test claims against what stone and soil can actually support. Radiocarbon dates come from charcoal and bone, and they arrive as probabilities rather than certainties. Ceramic styles shift like dialects, and those shifts can map networks that no document ever listed. Here the tension begins, because the ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence. At this altitude, the ruins look like they should be impossible, yet they are systematic, repeated, and stubbornly precise. The air is thin, but the architecture is thick with intention. You can feel the mismatch between the harshness of the setting and the confidence of the design. The monumental core includes platforms, sunken courts, and gateways that stage movement and attention. The planning implies authority that could mobilize labour, standardize work, and maintain ritual schedules across generations. From above, the site reads like geometry pressed into earth, rectangles, alignments, and deliberate voids. Down at ground level, those voids become acoustic bowls where footsteps and voices gather. Sunken courts are especially revealing because they choreograph descent and enclosure. Their walls hold carved heads and fitted stones, turning a simple pit into a controlled arena of sightlines. You do not stumble into such spaces by accident. You're guided into them. The architecture becomes a kind of instruction, telling bodies where to stand and where to look. Stonework is the headline, because it looks like a challenge issued across time. Large blocks of andesite and sandstone are shaped into clean planes, sharp angles, and joints that appear to erase the gap. The surfaces catch sunlight differently, so edges announce themselves with a thin line of shadow. In close-up, the stone feels less like rubble, and more like a deliberate instrument. Some blocks weigh many tons, yet they're finished with edges that meet like machined parts. The fit is not only aesthetic because tight joints resist shifting, distribute load, and reduce weak points. In seismic landscapes, even modest tremors can exploit bad joins, so precision becomes durability. The builders are not merely showing off, they are solving a long-term engineering problem. The question is not whether humans could do it, but how they did it reliably. The answer must be technical and social, because precision at scale requires both tools and institutions. A single artisan can shape a stone, but a city needs repeatability. Repeatability requires training, supervision, and a shared sense of what correct looks like. Andesite is hard, and it does not forgive casual work. Quarrying, roughing out, transporting, and finishing it demands planning, because mistakes waste months of labour and expose leaders to failure. Andesite's crystalline structure resists cutting, so it yields slowly under impact and abrasion. That slowness becomes a kind of discipline, forcing method over improvisation. Tool marks matter because they are the closest thing to a signature. Surfaces show pecking, grinding, and abrasion patterns consistent with stone hammers, hammerstones, and sand as an abrasive. Under raking light, tiny pits and overlapping strikes reveal the rhythm of repeated blows. A polished face can hide the struggle, but the microtexture remembers it. Copper alloy tools may have assisted in some contexts, but stone can do much of the work with time. Repeated pecking can remove material, and long grinding can true a face to a line. Abrasives like quartz sand act like countless small teeth, wearing down high spots until planes emerge. The process is slow, yet it is predictable, an advantage when precision matters. Straightness does not require steel if you have measurement and patience. Plumb lines, chords, sighting along edges, and templates can produce consistent angles when a workshop enforces standards. A taut chord becomes a reference line, and a weighted string becomes gravity made visible. With repeated checking, small errors are caught before they become permanent. Standardization appears in recurring forms, including grooves, notches, and joint designs. When parts repeat, it suggests trained specialists, shared methods, and inspection that rejects sloppy pieces. The repetition also implies planning in advance, because standardized blocks can be swapped and fitted within a system. That is a different mindset from ad hoc building, and it points toward organized production. One striking feature is the use of eye-shaped cramps, often called clamps. In some cases they are metal, sometimes copper-based, and in other cases clamp-like devices may be stone or absent depending on context. The very idea is revealing. Builders are thinking about lateral forces, not just vertical weight. They are treating stone like a connected framework, not a pile. These clamps sit in carved channels that bridge two blocks, locking them laterally. The logic is structural, because it ties stones together against vibration, settlement, and the slow push of time. A joined seam behaves differently than a loose seam, especially when temperature swings expand and contract materials. In a place of cold nights and strong sun that matters. The presence of standardized clamp slots suggests planning before placement. You do not carve a precise channel by accident after the block is set, because access and alignment would be constrained. The slot must match the clamp, and the clamp must match the neighbouring stone. That chain of fit implies a sequence, and a sequence implies forethought. Debate remains about how widespread metal clamps were and how they were cast or hammered. Some analyses look for residues, corrosion patterns, and the geochemistry of copper alloys to trace sources. The key point is that Tiwanaku builders use joining technologies, not only stacking weight on weight. Their architecture anticipates movement and resists it with design. Transport is another pressure point, because quarries are not always adjacent to the finished monuments. Moving heavy stone across high ground requires logistics, traction, and social coordination more than brute strength. The Altiplano is broad, and distances that seem short on a map feel long under thin air. Every kilometre adds friction, risk, and the need for provisioning. Llamas cannot carry multi-ton blocks, so people likely use rollers, sleds, ramps, and prepared routes. Wetting surfaces, using leverage, and staging moves in short segments can make the impossible incremental. A block moves when force is applied steadily and when the ground is engineered to cooperate. The labour is less about heroic strength and more about controlled repetition. Imagine the scene in motion, ropes taut, voices calling cadence, teams shifting position in practice cycles. Dust rises from the path, and the stone slides forward a hand's breadth at a time. Someone watches alignment, someone manages the rollers, and someone keeps the rhythm from breaking. In that rhythm you can hear organisation, because chaos would stop the stone. The monuments therefore imply an economy that could feed workers and schedule labour. Precision stone is not only craft, it is administration, because the workforce must arrive, persist, and be supplied. Food, textiles, and tools have to be stored and distributed, and that requires trusted systems. Even without writing, accounting can be done through memory, tokens, and social obligation. Yet, it still must be done. Tiwanaku's engineering is not limited to temples, because survival on the Altiplano is itself an engineered problem. The region can be fertile, but only if water and temperature are managed with care. Farming here is a negotiation with frost, with flood, and with the timing of rains. The landscape rewards those who can buffer extremes. This is where waru-waru, raised field agriculture, becomes central. Farmers build elevated planting beds separated by water-filled canals, turning flat wetlands into a patterned landscape of production. From the air, the fields look like woven fabric, parallel ridges and dark channels repeating to the horizon. On the ground, the canals mirror the sky, and the beds rise like deliberate islands. The canals store water during the day and release heat at night, reducing frost damage. The system creates microclimates, because water buffers temperature swings and protects young plants during cold snaps. In plain terms, the canals act like thermal batteries, charging under the sun and discharging after sunset. That stored warmth can mean the difference between a living plant and a blackened stem. The canals also manage drainage during heavy rains and retain moisture during dry spells. In a high-altitude environment, that flexibility can mean the difference between surplus and hunger. Water can be guided, slowed, and held, rather than allowed to run off uselessly. The fields become not just places to plant, but devices that regulate risk. Waru-waru is not a romantic theory, because it has been tested experimentally. Modern reconstructions show higher yields and better frost resistance compared to flat plots under similar conditions. Researchers measure soil temperatures, track plant survival, and compare harvest weights across seasons. The results make the ancient logic visible, turning a pattern in the earth into a quantified advantage. Those experiments matter for the series argument, because they turn speculation into measurable performance. A raised field system is a technology that can be verified, not only admired. It also shows that simple tools can produce complex outcomes when they are applied systematically. The sophistication is in the design and in the patience to maintain it. Large-scale waru-waru also implies collective labour and maintenance. Canals silt up, embankments erode, and weeds invade, so the system requires schedules, rules, and shared obligation. Maintenance is less glamorous than construction, yet it is the true test of governance. A state that cannot coordinate upkeep will watch its infrastructure dissolve back into mud. That obligation points back to governance without writing. When a state cannot archive orders on tablets, it must embed compliance in ritual, reciprocity, and visible infrastructure that everyone depends on. If the canals fail, everyone suffers, so everyone has a stake in the rules. The landscape itself becomes a contract, one that can be seen, walked, and enforced socially. Tiwanaku appears to have built a state-scale ritual economy that linked distant communities. Goods, labour and offerings flow toward the ceremonial core, then flow back as feasts, prestige and protection. This is not charity, it is a system of exchange that produces loyalty. When people bring surplus to the centre, they also buy into a shared order. Religion here is not a separate sphere because it is a governance technology. Shared symbols and repeated ceremonies can bind people who never meet, making cooperation feel like cosmic order. Belief can reduce transaction costs because trust is amplified by shared meaning. When the gods are watching, agreements carry weight beyond immediate enforcement. The gateway of the sun concentrates this logic into a single carved threshold. Its imagery includes the staff deity, a central figure holding staff surrounded by attendant beings in ordered rows. The stone stands like a frame for the sky, and the opening turns empty air into a sacred passage. You can almost feel the intention to make every crossing a reminder of hierarchy. The iconography is not only decoration, because it standardizes meaning across distance. When the same deity and motifs appear on textiles, ceramics, and stone, they become a portable constitution. Symbols travel more easily than administrators, and they reproduce themselves in households and workshops. In that way, art becomes policy that can be carried in a bundle. A distant village can recognize the same sacred grammar and the same implied hierarchy. That recognition can coordinate calendars, obligations, and alliances without a written law code. It can also settle disputes, because shared ritual frames what is legitimate. When meaning is standardized, negotiation becomes easier, even across long distances. Tiwanaku's art also suggests a controlled visual program, rather than individual improvisation. Consistency implies workshops, training, and authority over what images are permitted in public space. Artists are not merely expressing themselves, they are reproducing a sanctioned language. In a world without mass printing, this kind of consistency is a remarkable administrative achievement. Ritual gatherings likely synchronized agricultural cycles, labor mobilization, and exchange. In harsh environments, timing is survival, and ceremony can become the public clock everyone trusts. A festival can mark planting, harvest, or migration, and it can also redistribute food when it's most needed. The crowd becomes a mechanism, turning private schedules into a shared timetable. This is the deeper connection to earlier chapters. Nabta Playa used sky-linked ritual to synchronize movement, and Caral used plazas to turn performance into administration, and Tiwanaku scales that logic into a high-altitude state. The pattern is not that religion replaces politics, but that it carries politics in a form people will obey. The sacred becomes the interface for coordination. The stakes rise because Tiwanaku shows complexity, where the environment seems least forgiving. If civilization is coordination, then this is coordination under pressure, built from stone and water management. It raises a quiet question. How many other impossible societies have been underestimated because they left no texts? And what does it mean that we still measure legitimacy by writing, even when stone is speaking? Yet the same environment that rewards engineering can also punish it. The Altiplano climate is variable, and small shifts in rainfall can cascade through farming, herding, and political legitimacy. A few failed seasons can drain stored surplus, and that loss can unravel confidence. When leaders promise stability, weather becomes a political actor. Evidence for stress comes from lake levels, sediment cores, and other paleoclimate records. Researchers track changes in precipitation and evaporation through proxies that accumulate year after year. In lake sediments, layers of minerals, pollen, and microscopic organisms record wetter and drier phases. Each layer is a thin page, written not in ink but in chemistry. Around the late first millennium and into the early second, records indicate prolonged drought conditions in parts of the region. Lower lake levels and reduced water availability would strain raised fields and pasture. As water retreats, canals become harder to keep filled, and soils can salinize or compact. Even herds suffer, because pasture quality depends on moisture and plant regrowth. The key is correlation, not a single cause story. Climate can create constraints, but societies still make choices, and collapse is usually a chain of failures rather than one trigger. A drought tests institutions, and weak institutions fail faster than strong ones. The question becomes not only what the climate did, but what the system could absorb. If Waru Waru maintenance declines, yields fall and food security weakens. If food security weakens, leaders lose the ability to host feasts, reward labour and sustain the ritual economy. That loss is more than hunger. It is a loss of credibility. When promises cannot be kept, people begin to seek other arrangements. As confidence breaks, networks can fragment into local strategies. People may migrate toward more reliable water, shift to different crops, or attach themselves to new centres with different bargains. Some communities may double down on tradition, while others innovate or withdraw. Fragmentation does not mean ignorance. It means priorities changing under pressure. Conflict may rise, but it may also leave little trace in stone. Political breakdown can look like abandonment, repurposing, and shrinking ceremonial investment rather than dramatic destruction. A temple can simply stop being repaired, and a plaza can become quieter each season. Silence, in archaeology, can be as meaningful as fire. Tiwanaku's decline therefore becomes a test of the series' theme about disappearance. A civilization can be advanced, yet still be vulnerable to climate variability, ecological limits, and the fragility of coordination. The very systems that create power, centralized ritual, planned labor, engineered landscapes, can become liabilities when conditions shift. When the center cannot pay back loyalty, loyalty becomes negotiable. We should also remember the archive bias that has followed us since Doggerland. Tiwanaku's stone survives loudly, but its textiles, wooden tools, and spoken histories mostly vanish, leaving gaps we must not fill with certainty. Organic materials decay, and with them go colours, songs, and everyday instructions. What remains is impressive, yet incomplete, like hearing only the drums of an orchestra. Even the stone can mislead if we treat it as timeless. Monuments can be rebuilt, reused, and reinterpreted, and later communities can inherit spaces without inheriting the same institutions. A gateway can outlive the rituals that gave it meaning, and a court can host new gatherings with new rules. Continuity of place is not always continuity of power, so the responsible story is layered. Tiwanaku rises from earlier traditions, achieves state-scale integration through craft, agriculture, and ritual, then faces stresses that expose how hard coordination is to sustain. The story is not a simple arc of brilliance and ruin, but a sequence of adaptations under constraint. And beneath it all is a reminder that complexity is a relationship, not a trophy. The central question returns with sharper edges. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, then Tiwanaku proves that administration can be carved into landscapes and locked into joints. A canal can be a policy, and a clamp slot can be a standard, and a plaza can be a calendar. When we broaden our definition of record, the Andes stop being silent. It also warns that disappearance does not require ignorance, because knowledge can be real and still be outpaced by drought, political fracture, and shifting networks. The end of a system is not the end of the people, but it can erase the system's name. What survives is often the technique, scattered into local practice, while the central identity dissolves. From here, the countdown pivots from the Andes to the Pacific, where a tiny island holds statues so immense they look like a message to the sky. The next chapter asks how isolation, belief, and labour can raise giants, then trap a society inside its own achievement. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, when marks on clay or bark outlive the breath that spoke them. Rapa Nui begins with a voyage that left no ink, only landfall at the edge of the Pacific where the horizon feels like a wall. This chapter returns to the central question, because the island refuses easy beginnings and tidy endings. If writing is not the true start of civilization, what do the Moai reveal about coordination and about disappearance when a society's voice is pushed into silence? Easter Island is small, volcanic and remote, a triangular speck surrounded by an ocean that seems to repeat forever. Its isolation is not a metaphor, it is a constraint that shaped every choice: food, politics, technology, and even the limits of imagination. From the air, the island reads like a dark green bruise on blue water, with crater rims and lava flows set like old scars. The three main volcanoes, Terevaka, Poike, and Rano Kau, form a rough frame, and within that frame every resource becomes precious. The first settlers arrive from the wider Polynesian world, carrying more than people and tools across open water. They bring crops, animals, and an oceanic science that works without instruments, because instruments are heavy and the sea is indifferent. They also bring a cultural package that has already solved a problem most continents never faced. How do you find small islands scattered across thousands of kilometres, then return again and again without a written map to consult? Polynesian navigation is not guessing, and it is not luck, even if later outsiders described it that way. It is a trained reading of sky, sea, and living signals, an empirical craft refined by repetition, correction, and the harsh feedback of distance. Wayfinders memorize star paths that rise and set in predictable arcs, and they treat those arcs as moving signposts. They hold a mental compass built from nightly repetition, where each star's position becomes a direction you can name and keep. In practice, this means the canoe is steered toward a star's rising point, then shifted as the night turns. When that star climbs too high or sets, another takes its place, an invisible relay that keeps the bow honest. They also read swells because waves carry direction across thousands of kilometres, long after the wind that made them has changed. Long-period swells persist even when local winds change, and their rhythm can be felt through the hull like a second heartbeat. A skilled navigator separates wave patterns the way a musician separates instruments in a chord. One swell may come from a distant storm, another from local wind, and a third from the rebound of waves off unseen land. They watch clouds that gather over land and lagoons, because islands alter the atmosphere above them in subtle but reliable ways. A stationary cloud bank on a clear day can be a hint of terrain below, and a faint greenish tint can signal shallow water. They follow birds that forage out to sea and return at dusk, because birds have schedules that encode geography. Some species range widely and mislead, while others keep close to land, and knowing the difference is part of the curriculum. They track colour shifts in water and the drift of floating vegetation, because the ocean is not uniform when land is near. They notice how currents pull and how foam lines form, where converging flows gather debris like a moving boundary. Non-instrument navigation works through redundancy, and redundancy is what makes it resilient to error. When stars, swells, and birds agree, the ocean becomes a map you can feel, and when they disagree, caution becomes a technique. This knowledge is stored in memory, but it is not merely personal intuition. It is taught through apprenticeship, through named star lines and practice sequences, and through stories that function as mnemonics for routes and seasonal timing. Voyaging canoes make this possible at scale, and their engineering is part of the same intellectual tradition. Double hulls, lashings, and sail plans turn open ocean into a traversable corridor, where stability and cargo capacity make colonization realistic. The hulls are often bound rather than nailed, because lashings flex under stress instead of snapping. That flexibility matters when waves strike at odd angles, and it matters even more when a storm tests every joint at once. Sails are not just cloth-catching wind, they are adjustable wings that can be tuned. The crew changes angle, tension, and balance, translating wind into forward motion, while keeping the canoe from sliding sideways into wasted distance. Settlement on Rapa Nui is an experiment in limits, because the island offers no nearby coast to retreat to when harvests fail. Once the canoes leave the horizon behind, the nearest help is not a day away. It is a world away. The first generations would have read the land quickly because survival demanded it. Freshwater is scarce, soils vary by slope and exposure, and the wind can be relentless, drying plants and stripping unprotected ground. Yet within centuries the island becomes a monument factory, a place where stone faces multiply along the coast. Hundreds of moai rise, each one a public claim, and the sheer number forces us to confront organisation rather than accident. The quarry at Ranuraraku is the engine, a crater whose inner slopes became both workshop and archive. Here, volcanic tuff is cut, shaped, and detached from the living rock, and the hillside still holds the marks of that labour. Tuff is workable compared to harder basalt, but it is not soft like clay. It fractures if struck poorly, so the quarry demands controlled blows, patient abrasion, and a deep familiarity with the grain of the stone. Carvers work in teams with stone tools, likely using basalt picks to peck and scrape the surface into form. They rough out bodies in the quarry face, then finish details after extraction, when the statue can be rotated and inspected. The figures emerge belly down from the rock, as if they are being born from the crater wall. First the outline is freed, then the back is undercut, and finally the moai is slid onto a prepared bed of stones and earth. Many moai remain half-finished in the slopes, their faces still attached to the mountain. They are not just abandoned art, they are a frozen production line, and they make time visible in a way writing often does. Some appear complete but never moved, while others are only sketches in stone, stopped at the stage of rough geometry. That variation hints at interruptions, political shifts, resource constraints, or changing priorities that altered the rhythm of work. The scale forces a labour question that is as practical as it is social. How does a small population move statues that weigh tens of tons over uneven ground without metal tools, draft animals, or wheeled vehicles? Older explanations leaned on rollers and sledges because that is how many societies move heavy loads. Logs, ropes, and lubricated tracks could drag a statue across prepared routes, and the logic is straightforward to modern eyes. But the island's later deforestation made this model politically charged, because it seems to demand abundant timber. If logs were required, then statues imply forest destruction, and the moai become evidence in a courtroom rather than witnesses in a landscape. Another model proposes that moai walked, and the idea sounds like myth until you watch the physics. In this view, teams rock the statue side to side with ropes, inching it forward, using controlled instability as a motor. The statue's base, slightly curved and forward-leaning, becomes part of the mechanism. A pull on one side pivots the moai, then a pull on the other catches it, and the centre of mass advances in small, repeatable steps. Experiments show that walking is physically plausible, and they also show why coordination is the real technology. With synchronised pulls, a tall statue can pivot and advance without rollers, but only if the team behaves like one organism. In filmed trials, the ropes tighten like tendons, and the statue sways with a slow, dangerous grace. The moment it tips too far, the whole system fails, and that risk forces discipline, rehearsal, and clear leadership. Experiments also show limits and conditions, because plausibility is not the same as universality. Balance, base shape, rope control, and ground preparation decide whether walking works, and small differences can change everything. A statue with a different centre of gravity may resist walking, while a route with loose stones may amplify wobble. Even wind matters, because a tall figure catches gusts, and a sudden push can add chaos to an already delicate motion. The honest conclusion is not a single method, because real societies do not commit to one solution forever. Different eras, statue sizes, and routes may have used different transport solutions, and innovation often follows pressure rather than preference. The roads themselves become evidence, because they are not random scars across the island. Some paths show curbs and prepared surfaces that suggest planned movement, not improvisation, as if the landscape was engineered for procession. Along certain routes, moai lie toppled like fallen cargo, and their positions raise uncomfortable questions. Did they fall during transport? Were they abandoned mid-project? Or were they later pushed down as statements of victory or grief? Moai are not isolated sculptures, and their meaning is not contained in a single face. They stand on ceremonial platforms called ahu, facing inland toward communities, as if watching over gardens, houses, and the daily negotiation of survival. An ahu is architecture plus ancestry, built from fitted stone that can look deceptively simple. It ties the living to lineages, and it turns stone into a public genealogy, where memory is staged in the open air. Some platforms include cremation or burial features, binding the monument to the dead in literal terms. The moai then become more than decoration, because they stand where bodies and names are meant to endure. When the statues were raised, many wore pukao, large red scoria topknots that add height and spectacle. The colour contrast matters on a grey coast, and it signals that appearance itself was part of political language. Rapa Nui society is organised through clans and competing groups, and competition is not always violent to be consequential. Status is negotiated through display, ritual, and control of labour, and the moai are the most expensive sentences they could speak. Monument building becomes political technology because it converts food, time, and coordination into visible legitimacy that outlasts leaders. A finished statue is a durable record of who could command effort and who could keep promises long enough to complete it. Each statue signals capacity, and capacity is the hidden currency of power on a small island. It says this group can mobilise workers, feed them, and enforce shared schedules, even when storms or drought tempt people to defect. The series has followed this pattern across continents because coordination leaves architecture behind. Plazas at Caral and courts at Tiwanaku were also coordination machines, turning gatherings into governance and stone into a rehearsal for obedience. On Rapa Nui, the machine is more exposed because the island is small enough that every quarry cut and garden wall matters. There is no vast hinterland to hide extraction, and no distant province to blame when supplies tighten. The Moai also create a feedback loop that is familiar in human history, even when the materials differ. Success invites escalation, and escalation raises the cost of staying competitive until prestige begins to consume the very resources that support it. At that point, a society can become trapped by its own symbols, forced to keep building to avoid losing face. The question is not whether they were irrational, but whether the political incentives made restraint feel like surrender. This is where collapse stories enter, because outsiders love a clean moral arc. Popular narratives claim the islanders destroyed their forests, then destroyed themselves, as if the island were a sealed laboratory and the outcome a simple equation. The ecocide story is compelling because it feels like a lesson delivered by nature itself. It turns Rapa Nui into a warning carved in stone, and it flatters the storyteller by implying that we, today, have learned. But archaeology complicates the script because real landscapes rarely obey single-cause explanations. The island's ecological history is real, yet the causes are multiple and debated, and the sequence matters as much as the endpoint. Paleobotany reads the old landscape through pollen and charcoal, taken from sediment cores in lakes and wetlands. Layer by layer, those cores preserve microscopic traces of plants, and they preserve the soot of past fires like a slow-motion record. Those cores suggest major deforestation before European contact, including a decline in palm pollen that implies a transformed canopy. They also show fire signals, but fire does not name the arsonist, and it does not reveal intent. Humans certainly used wood for houses, canoes, fuel and tools because wood is the most flexible material in a pre-industrial toolkit. Clearing land for gardens also reduces forest cover, and repeated burning can lock a landscape into grass and scrub. Yet rats arrive with the first canoes, and their impact can be quiet but decisive. Polynesian rats eat palm seeds and prevent regeneration even without massive logging, because a forest collapses when the next generation never sprouts. Rat gnaw marks on seeds support this pressure, and the mechanism is brutally simple. A palm can live for decades, but if seedlings fail year after year, the forest becomes an aging population with no replacements. So the question becomes interaction, not blame, because systems fail through compounding stresses. Human clearing, rat predation, and climate variability can compound into rapid change, and each factor can amplify the others. Climate on a small island is shaped by ocean patterns that do not care about local plans. A run of drier years can reduce yields, and reduced yields can intensify competition, which then drives more clearing in search of new plots. Soils also matter, because volcanic landscapes can be fertile yet fragile, especially when exposed. Nutrients can leach in heavy rains, and wind can strip exposed ground, turning a once dark surface into a thinner, less forgiving skin. The island's slopes and ridges create microclimates, where one valley holds moisture and another bakes. In such a setting, agricultural knowledge becomes a form of navigation too, reading land the way ancestors read swells. Archaeology shows adaptation rather than simple failure, and adaptation leaves stone behind. Rock gardens and lithic mulching spread stones to retain moisture and heat, creating patterned fields that look like rough mosaics from above. Stones reduce evaporation and buffer temperature swings, and the effect is surprisingly practical. They also slow erosion and create microhabitats where crops can survive, because shade and trapped humidity can matter more than rainfall totals. Lithic mulch can also influence soil chemistry over time, as rocks weather and release minerals. The process is slow, but on an island measured in centuries rather than millennia, slow improvements can still change outcomes. These gardens are labour-intensive, and that labour is itself a clue about social organisation. They imply planning, maintenance and knowledge passed across generations, because a field of stones is not a one-time fix. The island's people also built stone walls and windbreaks, shaping airflow the way a sailor trims a sail. They engineered small-scale resilience in a place with no margin, and the walls still cut the wind like low, stubborn waves. In some areas, cultivation took place in sheltered enclosures, where plants could grow without being shredded by salt spray. The landscape becomes a patchwork of human choices, each one a response to scarcity rather than a surrender to it. This is the tension at the heart of Rapa Nui, and it is why the island keeps returning in global imagination. The same society that raised giants also built quiet infrastructure to endure, and both required coordination that could not be faked. Deforestation did not automatically mean collapse, because humans are not passive in the face of change. People can shift technologies, diets, and settlement patterns when forests retreat, and they can reorganize labor away from one prestige project toward another. Evidence suggests continued life and reorganization after major ecological change, including shifts in where people lived and how they farmed. The story is not a clean fall off a cliff, and the island does not offer us that simplicity. Still, conflict appears in later phases, and conflict is another form of coordination turned inward. Oral traditions and archaeology point to upheaval, shifting power, and new ritual forms, as if the old political language stopped working. Some Ahu are toppled in the late pre-contact or early contact era, and the site is haunting. Toppling can signal internal conflict, not only ecological despair, because knocking down an ancestor's image is a public act of negation. We should treat oral histories with respect and caution, because they are both archive and argument. They preserve memory, but they also compress time and moralize events, turning complex sequences into stories that can be carried. The most catastrophic rupture arrives from outside, and it arrives with sails on the horizon. European contact brings disease into an immunologically isolated population, where pathogens can move faster than any canoe ever could. In such populations, epidemics can be socially destabilizing, even when they are biologically ordinary elsewhere. When elders die, specialized knowledge dies with them: navigation lore, ritual protocols, and the practical memory of how to coordinate large work. Later, slave raids devastate communities, and the violence is not abstract. In the 19th century, Peruvian slavers abduct many islanders, including knowledge holders, and the loss is both demographic and cultural. The raids do more than reduce numbers, because they target the people who anchor continuity. When interpreters, priests, and leaders are taken, the community's ability to negotiate with outsiders and with itself is damaged. Colonial disruption follows, and it hardens into policy and property lines. Land is seized, movement is restricted, and traditional governance is undermined, turning an island of clans into an island of controlled access. Missionization and foreign administration reshape identity and ritual, sometimes by persuasion and often by pressure. The social fabric is cut, then rewoven under coercion, and the new weave does not preserve every old pattern. This is why self-inflicted ecocide is incomplete, even when environmental change is undeniable. It erases the violence of contact and it blames victims for later collapse, as if history only counts when it is convenient. It also misunderstands what the moai represent, because the statues are not proof of irrationality. They are proof of organized meaning, and meaning is a resource that can mobilize bodies, coordinate time, and stabilize identity under stress. Rapa Nui therefore becomes a mirror for our methods, and a test of our humility. Without writing, we build stories from pollen, bones, roads, and stone, and we ask those proxies to speak with the authority of text. Those proxies can be powerful, yet they can also be weaponized into simple parables. The responsible story stays multi-causal, because real societies rarely collapse for one reason, and they rarely survive for one reason either. The moai remain the central fact, and facts like this are stubborn. A small remote society coordinated quarrying, transport, and platform construction at scale, and it did so repeatedly across generations rather than in a single burst. That coordination required leadership, training, and shared belief, but it also required mundane logistics. It required food surpluses, predictable work rhythms, and conflict management that kept teams functioning when fatigue and rivalry could have broken them. It also required memory infrastructure, because coordination is impossible if obligations cannot be stored. In a world without texts, ritual, genealogy, and public monuments store obligations, and they store them where everyone can see. When you stand before an Ahu, you are not only looking at art, you are looking at a contract. The platform says who belongs, who owes what, and who has the right to claim labour, land, and respect. The island's isolation sharpens the series' hook, because it strips away excuses and distractions. If civilization began before writing, then civilization can also persist without writing, and it can reach sophistication without empires. Rapa Nui shows that advanced society is not defined by size or conquest, and they are not defined by metal or machines. They are defined by the ability to coordinate under constraint, especially when the constraint is permanent and visible. Yet the island also shows how fragile coordination can be, even when it looks monumental. Ecological shifts, internal competition, and external shocks can cascade, and the cascade can turn shared meaning into contested meaning. The climax of this chapter is not a single collapse date, because the island does not give us one. It is the collision between human adaptation and forces beyond local control, where resilience meets events that rewrite the rules. We return to the statues as witnesses, because they are the island's most durable testimony. They do not speak, yet they force us to ask what vanished when voices were taken, and what kinds of knowledge disappear first. What is lost when a navigator dies without an apprentice, or when a lineage breaks and no one remembers the names? What happens when coordination fails not from stupidity, but from the sudden removal of people who held the system together? From here, the countdown turns toward the oldest question in the series. Did some civilizations vanish not only by human error, but by planetary forces that reset the world? The final chapter will widen the lens beyond one island. It will ask what the Earth itself does to memory, through sea rise, climate swings, and sudden catastrophe. Stone and starlight remain, while paper and bodies disappear, and that asymmetry shapes what we think we know. The question is whether that pattern hides a deeper, repeating mechanism, one that returns again and again to erase the archives we trust. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but the series ends where writing fails. The central question returns with full weight, because the silence is not empty, it is patterned. If writing is not the true beginning of civilization, what do monuments and traces reveal, and why did so much disappear? Across 10 case studies, a shared signature keeps repeating without texts, almost like a fingerprint pressed into stone and soil. Monument building appears as organized labor made durable, from Göbekli Tepe to Tiwanaku to the Moai. In every case, the scale implies planning. Quarries chosen, routes cleared, teams fed, and work synchronized across seasons. Calendrics and astronomy appear as scheduling tools, from Nabta Playa alignments to Polynesian star paths. These are not merely pretty sky stories. They are timekeeping devices that coordinate planting, herding, fishing, and ritual gatherings. When a community can predict solstices, heliacal risings, or lunar cycles, it can also predict labor peaks and storage needs. Trade and exchange appear as connective tissue, from Caral's Coast Valley networks to Knox workshop worlds. Materials move farther than a day's walk, which means trust, negotiation, and repeated contact across social boundaries. Specialized labor appears in stone fitting, metallurgy, quarrying, and engineered agriculture, where skill is transmitted through apprenticeship rather than paper. Social memory appears as ritual landscapes, plazas, platforms, and repeated iconography that store obligations publicly. A plaza is not only open space, it is a stage where rules are rehearsed in front of witnesses. When memory is externalized in architecture, it can outlast any single leader, even if names dissolve. This is the synthesis the archive resists, because we are trained to treat writing as the switch that turns history on. Civilization is coordination, not ink, and coordination can be engineered into routines that feel ordinary. Institutions can live in training, standards, and shared calendars, even when genealogies vanish. The ground keeps producing inconvenient evidence, because stone preserves planning long after speech dissolves. The finale widens the lens beyond any single site. The pattern is not a straight line that begins at writing, then climbs steadily upward. It is a repeating cycle of innovation, monumentality, adaptation, and sometimes disappearance, where the same solutions reappear under similar pressures. The driver is often planetary because climate and sea level decide what survives to be found, and what is ground away before anyone can ask. The Lost Shorelines Hypothesis begins with a simple bias. Humans cluster on coasts, deltas, and river corridors because food and transport concentrate there. Estuaries mix nutrients, reefs shelter fish, and river mouths become natural crossroads for exchange. Those same places are the first to flood, erode, and bury evidence, so the most attractive habitats become the least legible archives. When seas rise and rivers migrate, the archive is physically removed, not merely forgotten. A shoreline is not a line. It is a moving zone of waves, storms, and sediment. Each metre of sea level rise can translate into kilometres of drowned lowland on shallow shelves. What was once a village edge becomes a surf zone, then a seabed, then a blank spot on the map. Doggerland made this visible in one drowned plain. Post-Ice Age warming raised seas by tens of metres and erased a lived landscape that had rivers, wetlands, and seasonal hunting grounds. Meltwater pulses could accelerate retreat within human lifetimes, turning routes into islands, then into seabed. A tsunami-like strega could punctuate the loss, scattering people and breaking continuity while leaving only sand layers. Imagine the visual: a broad green plain, then the waterline creeping inland year by year. Camps shift, paths shorten, and familiar landmarks become tidal flats. Then they vanish beneath grey water. The loss is not abstract. It is the destruction of orientation, where the map in the mind no longer matches the world. Now scale that mechanism globally. Ice Age termination reshaped every continental shelf, and most early shorelines now sit offshore. In many regions, the shelf is wider than the land people live on today, which means the missing area is enormous. Coastal camps, fish weirs, boatyards, and wooden architecture vanish first because they were built to flex. What remains on land is a biased sample, skewed towards stone, deserts, and high ground. Planetary resets are not only sea level. Drought cycles shift rain belts and collapse lakes, as the green Sahara became desert again. When monsoon systems weaken, grasslands fragment into dust, and migration corridors close like doors. Volcanic winters can shorten growing seasons and destabilize food stores, even when monuments still stand. Tsunamis and storm surges can erase low settlements in hours, then redeposit them as unreadable layers. Riverine societies face selective erasure too. Floodplains are productive, but channels migrate and cut through old ground, slicing history into scattered fragments. Silt buries floors, then later erosion exposes them without context, inviting myths or looting. In the tropics, heat, roots, and insects dissolve wood, fibre, and bone, leaving only fired clay and slag. The absence is not a mystery of intelligence, it is a chemistry of decay. This is why the series kept returning to method. Radiocarbon dates require context, calibration, and contamination control, because a number without provenience is just a number. Marine reservoir effects can skew coastal dates, and old wood problems can make structures seem older than their use. Stratigraphy is the difference between a story and a souvenir, because layers preserve sequence even when objects travel. Archaeastronomy demands statistics and caution, because chance alignments are easy to imagine when you want them. A convincing pattern must repeat across features and match the horizon, latitude, and era. Ancient DNA and residue analysis can clarify migrations and diets, but they cannot replace provenience. A genome without context can tell you who, but not what happened. Here, the tension resolves into a rule. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially where the planet deletes archives. We should expect missing chapters where preservation is worst, and we should expect surprises where preservation is best. The question is not whether something existed, but whether the world allowed it to remain. From here, the finale turns toward the archaeology of the future. Underwater surveys are no longer a niche, because the continental shelf is the largest lost landscape on Earth. Multi-beam sonar maps drowned river channels and shorelines like ghost topography, revealing terraces, cutbanks, and ancient estuaries. Sub-bottom profiling can reveal buried surfaces beneath later sediments, where older ground is sealed like a time capsule. Autonomous submersibles extend that reach beyond divers and weather windows. They can run grids, photograph anomalies, and return with precise geolocation, so a scatter of stones becomes a mapped site. Remote sensing from satellites and aircraft can also detect paleo channels, soil marks, and hidden mounds on land. The next Göbekli Tepe may be offshore, sealed by mud and time, and protected by depth until we learn to read it. New biomolecular tools widen what counts as evidence. Proteomics can identify species from degraded proteins when DNA fails, turning a fragment into a lineage. Sedimentary ancient DNA can detect human presence indirectly through soils and lake beds, even when bones are absent. Microwear, isotopes, and residue chemistry can reconstruct economies that left no texts and few artifacts. A single residue can reveal milk, fish oils, or plant starches, quiet signatures of daily life. These tools do not guarantee lost cities. They change the probability of detection, and they refine the questions we can ask. They also force humility, because every new method has false positives, blind spots, and ethical costs. Better instruments do not remove uncertainty. They make uncertainty measurable. Responsible wonder becomes the final discipline. Impossible monuments are not permission to abandon evidence. They're invitations to ask better technical and social questions, then test them with replicable measurements. Tiwanaku stone joints demand measurement systems, training and logistics, not aliens and shortcuts. The marvel is human organisation, patient, cumulative, and often invisible in the final stone. Rapa Nui statues demand coordination and experimentation, not a morality play built from one variable. The ecocide narrative collapses under multi-causal evidence, including rats, climate variability, and colonial catastrophe. The real story is more dramatic because it changes with data, and because it implicates systems, not caricatures. What would it mean to judge any society without seeing the disasters that struck after outsiders arrived? The series also reframes continuity and disappearance. Göbekli Tepe may have been deliberately sealed, suggesting ritual closure rather than sudden collapse. That act implies governance, deciding together to end a chapter, then doing the labour to bury it. Nabta Playa may or may not connect to later Nile traditions, and the evidence must stay probabilistic. Knock metallurgy debates remain open because disturbed contexts demand higher proof, not louder claims. Caral's administration may have used tactile records, and the question remains testable through patterning and storage contexts. Tiwanaku's drought correlation remains a chain to be strengthened with more proxies and regional comparison. Across cases, collapse often looks like dispersal and reconfiguration, not extinction, and names vanish faster than people. When a network breaks, skills can persist in smaller communities, carried like embers. So the central question can finally be answered without overreach. Civilization predates writing in many forms, because coordination can be stored in monuments, landscapes, and trained memory. What vanished often did so because homes were coastal, riverine, or built from perishable materials. The planet erased their archives first, then later cultures rewrote the surface. This does not make every myth a map. It makes the deep past a research frontier with rules where romance must submit to context. We follow context, dates, and replicable methods, then we let uncertainty remain visible. Wonder is not the enemy of rigour, but sensational certainty is. If the past is fragmented by geology, why would we expect a single clean origin story? The finale returns to the opening hook and turns it outward. Recorded history begins when humans start writing, but human history begins when humans coordinate at scale. The oldest monuments are not anomalies that break the timeline. They are signals that the timeline is incomplete, and that the missing pages may lie underwater, beneath silt, or inside soils that still hold molecular traces. We end with a final perspective. The night sky above ruins is almost unchanged, while the human story beneath it keeps being revised. Stars still mark seasons, and stones still hold alignments, even when coastlines move and languages die. History is a deep ocean with only a few islands above the surface, and the next island may rise from the sea. Across 10 chapters, we followed a trail that begins before ink and ends where only stone, soil, and starlight remain. At Göbekli Tepe, belief gathered people before fields could, and its deliberate burial reminded us that endings can be chosen, not only suffered. At Çatalhöyük, a city grew without kings or archives, proving that dense life can be governed by shared ritual, neighbours, and memory held in walls. Doggerland showed how whole homelands can be erased between a grandparent and a grandchild, as seas rose and a tsunami may have finished what slow water began. Nabta Playa turned the sky into a schedule, where alignments and cattle burials acted as a social clock, even as the green Sahara dried and routes collapsed toward the Nile. Knock warned us that in humid worlds civilization can survive as fragments. Terracotta faces slag and charcoal, while looting and disturbed soils blur the very proofs we need. Caral Supe revealed a city network built on fish, cotton, canals and ceremony, and it raised the possibility of administration without writing, perhaps in knots and tallies. Tiwanaku pushed precision to the edge of disbelief, hinting at measurement systems, training, and metal-clamped stonework that outlasted any spoken explanation. Rapa Nui brought the story to an island horizon, where isolation magnified every choice, and later disruptions showed how quickly knowledge can fail when the keepers vanish. Widening the lens, the Lost Shorelines Hypothesis tied these cases together, arguing that our map of origins is skewed toward deserts and highlands, while drowned coasts and shifting deltas hide the missing pages. What emerges is a recurring fingerprint: monumentality, calendrics, trade, specialization, and ritual landscapes, evidence of coordination strong enough to reshape environments, yet fragile enough to disappear when climates swing and archives decay. So if writing is not the true beginning of civilization, the monuments answer with a quieter definition. Civilization begins wherever humans learn to coordinate at scale, remember across generations, and turn landscape into shared purpose. And if these are the fingerprints of societies older than writing, their vanishing is not always a single collapse, but a mix of dispersal, climate whiplash, rising seas, and the simple fact that daily life was built from materials the Earth can erase. The question was never whether the past is empty. It was whether our methods were listening in the right places, and whether we mistake silence for absence. In the end, stone does not tell us everything, but it tells us enough to be humbled. The greatest lost civilizations may not be myths, only chapters the planet learned to delete. If we want those chapters back, we have to protect sites on land, explore the drowned shelves with care, and practice responsible wonder that demands evidence as fiercely as it welcomes awe.